Rule Stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov at LevPo on Twitter. It is a great pleasure to be here today with Michael Tracey, Bastiat, Giovanni Pennacchietti. We are going to be getting into the nitty-gritty today of the situation that is still obviously ongoing between Russia, Ukraine, what exactly is going to be happening in the future, as well as looking at what were some of the things that led up to where we currently are. And I know that Bastiat and Michael have different ways of looking at this. Somebody is clicking. I don't know who that is, but I know that you guys have different ways of looking at this situation, and I want to get into it, but keep it very good faith. Like, I want to make sure that even though, and I'm going to say it again,
Does that apply to you as well,
Ukraina, Slava Ukraina, you know, the shirt,
Oh,
despite that.
see, you
No,
just
despite
biased
that.
it.
No, despite
It's
that.
over.
Despite
now
that.
I have to do a Hal Putler just to balance that out.
Despite that, what I'm going to say is that despite that, I want to make sure that everybody here has their chance to speak. I don't want any interruptions. I want to make sure that we could all get our points across like civilized human beings, because at the end of the day, I think we're all after the truth. We all want to figure out what's going on, and that's why it is a great pleasure to be here. I also want to say, don't forget to subscribe to Break the Rules. Break the Rules brings everybody together of different persuasions, different ideas of what's going on in the world, as well as bringing the insiders and the outsiders together. So I really appreciate that. Please subscribe, and don't forget to click the bell and add a like. It helps the algorithm out tremendously. I guarantee it that's going to be really, really good. Anyway, to get us started, I want to find out a little bit about Bastiat and Michael. So, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You are a journalist. You are a lover of dogs, which is great. I love dogs as well. And you are New York City-based. So, yeah, go for it, my friend.
Yeah, I still don't have a good elevator pitch for myself to just distill my essence into a few pithy sound bites. But yeah, I'm a journalist, largely on Substack, although I've written for publications across the political spectrum over the years. I'm probably one of the few journalists that can say they've written for both the American Conservative and The Nation and, you know, Mother Jones and Reason Magazine and stuff. Yeah, I had an interesting interlude where for a year and a half or so I did work for the Young Turks. It was actually the only time really maybe the past 10 years or so that I had a full-time media job where I was tethered to one institution. Other than that, I've been largely independent, although, you know, I have different affiliations, I guess you would say, with a variety of outlets. I live in actually Jersey City, although I just say I'm from New York City for simplicity's sake. Any other questions, feel free to ask. I was on a stream last night and I was urged to go into my whole backstory, starting with childhood and stuff. I don't know if you want to get into that in great detail. But,
it was a different stream we would actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Bastiat, let us know a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I go by Bastiat here on the World Wide Web. I lately have been doing a lot of posting on Twitter, but I also once in a while stream on twitch.tv and YouTube. By day, I work as an attorney in the natural gas industry. That's what I've been doing for, I guess, the last 8 years or so. Just attorney in the energy business. And I typically come at things from what I would call a liberal perspective, although I know that's one of those words that can be twisted in a lot of different ways. And I really enjoy politics and discussions like this. So looking forward to it. And I got to say, Lev has, perhaps more than anybody else I've ever worked with on doing anything like this, has been more studious about scheduling than, I got to say, anybody else. So kudos to you for taking what you do seriously.
I appreciate it, man. And by
natural guessing will come up. According to the news today, I'm sure that will come up as a topic. But
Basti, can I ask, just for my own edification, what is the flag that's tied to the American flag on your lapel pin?
I figured the NATO pin would be
okay, got it.
Here. Yeah.
I thought it could be EU, but I can't quite see. So
I have that one, but yeah, I like the flag pin. It's kind of a personal.
So let's
We
Yes,
need
it's a
one of
nice
those NATO Fash wave edits right now. Throw up on the screen though.
with the hologram. Yes.
No, we
So,
don't need no fash wave edits, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
all right. So let's.
Uh,
Okay. Let's get into it now. So, I want to find out first from Michael and then Bastiat your view on what, since we are more or less. I mean, Gio, you might as well be in America. What the American/Western response should be to what's going on right now with Russia and Ukraine, so as to ensure the best outcome as we see it. So that's kind of a general thing that I want to bring out right now. I will save more conversations about that in the future, because then I want to get into justifications over what happened, different things like that, but just like a general overview of what you see there. So Michael, go for it.
Well, I think before getting into any kind of prescriptive analysis of what ought to be done, it's probably necessary to first spell out descriptively what has been done, just to kind of at least perhaps come to some degree of consensus, although I'm sure some of what I'll say here is going to be contested. But it seems blaringly apparent to me, and has for basically the entirety of this whole episode, that the U.S. has constantly sought to escalate the war in its own way rather than de-escalate the war. And there are a number of aspects of this. Number one, rhetorically, Biden has gone much further in his personalized denunciations of Putin than any American president ever did with the leader of the Soviet Union over the course of the Cold War. Like, you would never have had John F. Kennedy in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis excoriating Khrushchev, for example, as a perpetrator of genocide, or calling him a war criminal, or declaring that regime change ought to be imposed upon the Soviet Union to collapse the governance structure. But Biden has done all that since February. And this culminated, I would say, probably in the most vivid form when Biden delivered that marquee speech in Warsaw, Poland at the end of March that climaxed at the very sort of end of the speech with Biden essentially, for the first time, publicly demanding regime change in Russia. He said Putin must go, or something to that effect. And that was a momentous statement for an American president to make about the country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Now, of course, there was that kind of fake walk back, good cop, bad cop routine that was done in the immediate aftermath, where the White House press operatives immediately sent emails to all their favorite journalists saying, oh, he didn't actually mean a change in U.S. policy. This is not the official U.S. policy, although what is official U.S. policy? Anyway, that's sort of a digression. The point is that Biden has over and over again escalated rhetorically to the point that I think he made it, whether intentionally or not. I mean, it's hard to know how much intentionality Biden can really have given his mental state, sorry to say. But whatever the reason, his very much escalated rhetoric has poisoned the well, you could say, for any kind of diplomatic or negotiated settlement potentially being on the offing. And if we're broadening it out to the broader West, the UK is actually also somewhat instructive in how it's handled this, with Boris Johnson and senior UK government officials at times even going even further than the US in demanding ever more escalatory steps taken in Ukraine. So, for example, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss 2 weeks or so ago gave a major speech in London where she essentially said that no resolution is tenable in Ukraine if Russia continues to occupy any inch of territory, which would include Crimea, which is kind of a step beyond what the status quo even was before the invasion was launched. And then sure enough, this week, there were reports from, I don't know what the exact title is of this Ukrainian official, but it is reported in Politico that some senior ranking official in the Ukraine government basically echoed what Liz Truss said and said, we're not willing to broker any kind of accord here unless Russia is entirely pushed out of all of Ukraine, which I think is happening in concert with the escalation on the more military front on the part of the U.S., where throughout March and April, there were indications that the U.S. was gradually expanding the range of operations it was willing to partake in on behalf of Ukraine or with Ukraine in the intensity of the warfare. And that came to a head last week when it was reported in the New York Times via leaks that the U.S. had been operationally involved. There's sort of a dispute as to how crucial the U.S. involvement was, but nonetheless, it was operationally involved in, for example, the killing of Russian generals and the sinking of the flagship Russian warship, which is, again, something that you never would have seen over the course of the Cold War, or it never would have been so cavalierly bragged about. Maybe somebody could correct me if there's a Cold War episode that I'm not immediately recollecting. It's sort of interesting, talking about going to the West, whenever Emmanuel Macron in France tries to initiate some kind of diplomatic channel with Putin, you might notice that he's roundly ridiculed and scorned and basically called a total dupe, and was even criticized recently by his predecessor, Hollande, nominally the Socialist Party leader, although that party's basically been decimated in France, for more or less appeasing Putin. Which is bizarre. I mean, how is this conflict to be resolved if not with negotiations and diplomacy? Even at the most kind of hellish low points of the U.S.-Soviet relationship, it was always insisted upon, really by both sides, that there was no other option but to have open diplomatic channels. And those seem to be more and more foreclosed. Even just this week in Congress, there was a bill that was being deliberated upon in the House that would basically exclude all Russian officials from any of these international meetings, like the economic forums and so on and so forth, so that there's not going to be any interaction anymore between senior level officials between the two governments, which basically seems like, to me, a recipe for each side to dig in and for the U.S. to just do what it's been doing, which is not to announce. I mean, on a given week, the U.S. isn't announcing some new diplomatic front, some new diplomatic endeavor that it's pursuing. No, what they announce is more and more weaponry and higher grade weaponry. So one week, earlier on, Biden said, it would be too escalatory to send fighter jets through this arrangement that Poland was trying to orchestrate, right? And then a couple of weeks later, Biden's criticized by both Democrats and Republicans for being a wuss. And then it turns out that the U.S. is facilitating the shipment of fighter jets to Ukraine in this more roundabout way.
Michael, I want to make sure that Bastiat has a chance to respond again.
Oh yeah, I'll wrap up. I'll wrap up. And then you also, heavy artillery and tanks, and, you probably are familiar with this roster of weapons that are being more and more sent. And then just this week, we have the kind of culmination of that with $40+ billion in new war funding being almost unanimously approved, with every single Democrat actually approving it, and just a handful of Republicans objecting, although some objected on procedural grounds and don't actually have any problem with it on principle. But that's another digression. The point is that if you look at the broad thrust of what the U.S. has done, I don't know how you can conclude anything other than that it's been intentionally escalatory on a variety of dimensions. And so before you get into anything prescriptive about what ought to be done going forward, I think that has to be sort of acknowledged as the trajectory that we've been on thus far.
And I guess the question is whether the escalatory trajectory is the right one or not. But Bastiat, take it away. I would love to hear your response to that.
Sure. So I don't accept the notion that the United States has been engaging escalatory behavior at all. In fact, the United States has repeatedly made attempts to de-escalate, while the Russians have continually attempted to escalate. For example, while the Russians were building troops up on the border, the United States made it clear that it knew what the Russians were up to and repeatedly attempted to share its intel with the world almost as soon as it got it. That intel eventually turned out to be correct, that the Russians were planning an invasion, even though the Russians repeatedly lied to the world and said there was going to be no such invasion. The United States refrained from providing some of the heaviest arms to Ukraine until the outbreak of war. Now, perhaps that may very well be seen as having been a real disaster in terms of setting the Ukrainians up for less success than they've had as a result. But the United States, as a result, certainly tried to avoid sending some of the heaviest weapons as a sign of its intent not to escalate. The United States repeatedly said that it was not going to deploy troops to Ukraine. There would be no American soldiers in Ukraine. When the prospect of a no-fly zone came up, most discussion about that seems to have gone away, but that was something that was discussed for at least a few weeks after the outbreak of war. President Biden repeatedly said that there would be no such no-fly zone, that in fact that would be World War III. Another sign that while the United States is clear in terms of its desire to help the Ukrainians in a material sense, that it has no interest and wants to avoid direct confrontation with the Russians. The United States has also repeatedly said that it's for the Ukrainians to make their own decisions in terms of any diplomatic settlement with the Russians. But at the same time, the United States has also refused to accept the notion that the Russians have some kind of entitlement to a victory of some form in Ukraine. This kind of notion of an off-ramp where Russia gets something out of the war. I think this is certainly the right policy, and it is certainly true that America has rejected the idea of a diplomatic settlement in the form of, say, of course, would be up to the Ukrainians, but America seems very disinterested in a diplomatic settlement that would involve surrendering more territory to the Russians, including much of the territory that they've already taken. In fact, through America's provision of weapons and supplies to the Ukrainians, and of course, primarily through the heroic efforts of the Ukrainians themselves, they pushed an invasion that was initially made on 3 or 4 axes away from the capital, away from Kyiv, away from the northeast, and instead have forced the Russians to consolidate in a much narrower front. In essence, American help, and of course the help of many of our allies as well, has ensured that the scope of what Russia can reasonably achieve has itself been scaled back considerably. So even after the outbreak of war, America's involvement here has not led to some wider war, but has in fact prevented the larger gains that the Russians seek to make, and in so doing prevented the Russians, at least for now, from carrying their war in Ukraine elsewhere. Moldova, for example, where the Russians have had troops since 1993 during the Yeltsin years, predating really all of what we might talk about tonight, or at least a lot of it. So American involvement has been of a nature that I think you might look at it as being escalatory if you have a generally negative view of the military or the provision of armaments in general. But if you're thinking about what I think America's real goal is, which is to prevent a war or to prevent a future conflict with the Russians, a general conflict, as opposed to the conflict with Ukraine that Russia has sought out and now realized, American policy makes a lot of sense. Because one, America has sought to ensure that Russia doesn't feel like it gets something out of this kind of hostile, aggressive act. For example, America tried to engage Russia with diplomacy before the outbreak of war, but it did refuse to accept Russia's terms for one-on-one negotiations that would mean the exclusion of Ukraine from NATO in written form, right? And America made this decision. America did this because, sure, over the short term, that might theoretically have possibly prevented the war. Of course, there's no way of knowing that. It doesn't really stand to reason to imagine that saying that no help would be coming to Ukraine would somehow ensure that this country that has been repeatedly conquered by the Russians would somehow avoid that fate again. But the United States has engaged in a policy that has been designed, I think, over the long term, with kind of the long view in mind of avoiding a greater conflict in Europe and empowering the Ukrainians to have some say over their own future. So if President Zelensky should decide that he wants to surrender or accept some loss, that will be ultimately his decision. The U.S. doesn't really have any way of attempting to stop him. The U.S. ultimately offered him evacuation and another arguable form of de-escalation when it offered him a ride out of the Capitol, to which, of course, he famously said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." So this idea that the United States has repeatedly tried to escalate things, I just don't think is true. All you can really say toward that end is that America has given a country the tools that it needs to defend itself, and done so in a way that ultimately doesn't rob the Ukrainians of agency, but does help ensure that Russia is not able to get away with this kind of aggression in such a fashion that will encourage it to do it again. potentially, given how much of Europe is in NATO, in a way that would require a direct American response that I think none of us wants.
Well, if we're talking about aggression, I want to get right now to justifications. So there is the idea that Russia was betrayed by NATO, which promised that it would not expand. That's from that famous James Baker conversation with President Gorbachev at the time. So I want to get into that a little bit just to see what exactly we can dig out from that, because I think a lot of these conversations go back to the idea of, was there a justification to Russia to act in the way that it did in response to the West? But before that, to one of the things that Michael said, I want to add a caveat, which is I don't think it's correct to compare the Soviet Union to Russia. Even during Stalin's time, there were two competitive powers at play. There was the NKVD, that was the KGB back during that time, and then there was also the Communist Party itself. These were always two organizations that even when you had somebody like Stalin, he still had to answer to the Politburo. There was still some kind of a balance that was going on there. After Gorbachev got rid of the Communist Party, it was not the same anymore because you have the KGB with all the influence and all the leadership, and that's been the way it has been since then, since Putin ended up taking over. So I wouldn't say it's exactly the same thing if we're comparing the USSR to the Russian Federation as it is currently right now, just because there really isn't any check to the power that Putin's government has as there was in the USSR. So in a way, I'm kind of defending the USSR by saying this right now, but I don't know. Any comments to that? Any clarification?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wasn't asserting that.
What was the original
Russia
thing you said,
and the
Michael?
USSR.
Well,
about Ukraine or about the USSR? I missed the original.
Oh, sure. So I just want to make sure that it's understood that when we're
No.
talking,
What was it you were replying to that Michael
yeah.
said?
Oh, I'll tell you. Yeah. What I was replying to was the idea that the kind of way that the U.S. is handling Russia today, the response that it's giving to Russia, was never precedented in terms of how it responded to the USSR. I want to point out in that sense that it is a much more totalitarian country. I'd say I don't want to instigate that. What was that
wait,
law?
Lev, but you're saying current Russia is more totalitarian than the Soviet Union?
Yes. How's that for a hot
Okay.
take? How's that for a hot
That
take?
is,
I
Not in terms of. I will
just
explain. Hold on.
Russia.
Not in terms of. Hold on a second. Not in terms of what it actively did during the time of Stalin as far as the purges. Not in terms of that, but simply in terms of there not being a check to power that the Politburo was towards the leadership during the USSR.
But is that totalitarianism, or is that just
that's one
concentration of power?
Well,
I think I see what he's saying.
That's one
If you
person
mean-
being
Okay,
able to wield
can I
power.
just
I'm
add
not-
some since you were addressing something I said
I'm
in my
checking.
opening
Yeah.
remarks? I wasn't saying that anything about Russia and the Soviet Union are, quote, the same. I was simply noting the discrepancy in how previous American presidents have rhetorically interchanged with leaders of the Soviet Union in contrast to what Biden has done in upping the ante such that he's actively accusing Putin of genocide and calling him a war criminal and basically calling for his government to be toppled. I think that's just a difference in approaches over the ages that's worth dwelling upon. And in noting that comparison, I'm not drawing any kind of similarities or dissimilarities between the Russia and the Soviet Union, except on this narrow point of the dealings between the two respective leaders.
Yeah, that I think is a bit overstated. I know what President Biden said during the speech in Warsaw, and if you don't want to chalk it as some kind of improv Biden gaffe, apparently it wasn't in the text of the actual speech. Any comments about his mental health aside, at the end of the day, that's one comment that they felt fit for whatever reason to retract.
Well, it was in a formal speech in a foreign capital.
I know, but
compared to speech, it wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark.
President Reagan making it a point repeatedly to call the Soviet Union an evil empire.
But even Reagan didn't personalize it about.
Well, I will say you are right that it's more personalized now with Putin, and that actually does get to sort of what I think Lev was saying. Well, I think it's kind of an interesting point. This is sort of an aside. You could definitely say, I'd say that Russia today is a personalist kind of dictatorship, whereas the Soviet Union was, at least after Stalin, it was an institutional sort of tyranny. So you could say, it's a little different, I guess. It's kind of hard to.
Well, let me put it this way.
Brezhnev, the Soviet state, we all acknowledge the problems of the Soviet
Okay,
Union.
but like whatever
it's
the difference in kind of the
Well, it's
governance
just a little different there. I mean,
structures
if
of
you're
Russia
thinking about
versus the Soviet
Stalin,
Union. I mean, but
the same
whatever
kind of
whatever
stuff.
the difference is in the orientation of the Soviet Union and Russia today as states, I think it's pretty easy to acknowledge that the tenor rhetorically that's been espoused by the current president about the leader of Russia differs drastically from what had been the norm over the course of the Cold War. Is that not true?
I just don't know that I would say that. I mean,
I
if you're
have
talking about one reference that was
at what point
cuff,
did the U.S. president ever accuse a head of the Soviet Union of committing genocide?
in terms of
The
terms
time
of
when
like
the Soviets actually were
Stalin,
committing genocide. I mean, that's
in terms of like public announcement, in terms of like public speech. I mean, in terms of the way that the United States has discussed what the
I think
Soviet
we'd know
Union
it. I
has
think it
been
would be
doing.
a notable thing in history that we
it's
probably
just-
all
Well, we do have a
remember.
we do have a comparison
but
with
that's
Adolf.
like-
I have an answer.
Wait. We do have a comparison with Adolf Hitler. I mean, I don't want to be the guy who keeps bringing those
Lev,
things
Austrian
in.
painter for the algorithm. We can't say on
Can I-
YouTube. Austrian painter.
All right, go for it, Bastiat.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go back and forth a little bit with Michael on this. I get what you're saying. I'm not aware of any kind of reference like that, but I mean, I think that kind of the tenor of Reagan's administration, kind of the discussion of nuclear exchange between the two powers. I mean, it's hard to really say that compared to Joe Biden in one speech right after what was revealed, I think to be some pretty deplorable murder in the formerly Russian occupied parts of eastern Ukraine. I think that's just really overstated to say that that's a unique tenor. I also think it's a little strange to really kind of say that anything else about the war is particularly unprecedented, at least in Cold War terms. The one thing I'd say that is a little unprecedented is that we're in Ukraine, which is like in Europe as opposed to maybe in Africa or Asia. But other than that, like Korean War, Vietnam War, Soviet pilots were shooting at American pilots. Now they lied and claimed, that in the Korean War claimed to be Chinese pilots. In Vietnam War, they didn't even come with a pretext. They just did it and then denied that it ever happened. So, in previous wars, the Soviets have gone even more boldly and directly in terms of engagement. That's not to say, of course, that the Soviet Union and Russia are the same or anything, but if we're thinking about precedents and former kind of proxy type engagements, I wouldn't exactly call Ukraine a proxy war, given that Ukraine's not really a proxy. It's a country that we're
You wouldn't call Ukraine a
but the
proxy
logic
war?
is sort of the same. No, I wouldn't call it a proxy war in the sense that like this is a country that we control and dominate in the same way
we
that
kind of
say,
do,
But
actually.
that's
the
not-
administration
that's
of
not
say
what's implied.
South Vietnam. I mean,
That's not
if you
what's
mean
implied by the term proxy war. Just a couple of things before I lose track. On the issue of just presidential rhetoric, don't want to get too bogged down in that because it's only one component of the overall sort of bilateral relationship. But you mentioned Reagan, famously or infamously declaring that the Soviet Union was the evil empire. But notwithstanding that, a couple of years later, he met personally with Gorbachev on numerous occasions, and they came to agreements on arms control treaties, which
They had KFC
the INF, which was abrogated a few years ago under Trump. But that was, one of Reagan's brainchilds toward the end of his tenure. And can you imagine today Biden and Putin getting together personally to forge some kind of diplomatic arrangement? It's hard to fathom that at this point.
Well,
Whereas
that's
it's
why
never particularly
real
hard to
quick.
fathom
Let
that,
me interject.
Wait, I got to interject
interject
first.
I really think
Okay.
I should go back and forth a little bit more here.
I gotta say one thing, Bastiat, and then you are free to go back and forth. Because I said
No, Lev, I think you should.
no.
Bastiat's being
Hold on.
far more
I
reasonable
know
than you are,
he's
Lev. I
being
can't believe that. I'm shocked.
he's being extremely reasonable. I understand. I just want to say one thing real super quick, and it is that the comparison that I would make. I know some people see it as a cringe comparison. I don't care. I don't give a shit. I would say that the better comparison would be if Biden or some American president would sit down with somebody like Adolf Hitler, for example. And I know people are going to say, oh my God, how could you compare the two? But in terms of having a one-man rule and having it be expansionist, that is a very different strategy than was employed by the USSR during the time of Gorbachev. So already the United States was looking towards the USSR as potentially turning over a new leaf and becoming a very different kind of country than it was during the time of Stalin. That's all I wanted to say. Bastiat, go for it.
Right. Well, look, I guess I would just say that, let's see, we were talking about the Cold War. Oh, yeah. So, Michael, yeah, you make the point. Yeah, it's hard to imagine this with Putin. Well, it's kind of hard to imagine that with Putin. But then again, at the same time, while, a couple of years, you mentioned a couple of years after what Reagan said, all of his rhetoric. And of course, he had a whole career of being very hard in the Soviet Union, very, very much so, part of his election campaign and all that. He did some of these very notorious ads about how the Russians are a bear and you can't trust them and all that. But shortly after that, even you're right, he comes to these arms control agreements with the Soviets. He's doing that at the same time that he is arming the Mujahideen to kill Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan. So the idea that countries like the United States and Russia are not able to do business and negotiate, I mean, during a situation like this, I don't think.
Well,
that's
is there
really
any
the
evidence
case.
that it's happening now? I mean, so
Well,
just a couple of other things. First on the question of whether this constitutes a proxy war, I recognize that it's sort of a nomenclatural question, but I do think it's important in the sense of just clarifying what we're dealing with in terms of policy. My experience in discussing this kind of narrow issue with people is that they tend to think, and I think, Bastiat, you sort of articulated this, that by using the term proxy war, you're denying the agency of the Ukrainians or suggesting that they're being unduly controlled by external forces and, don't have autonomy to want to wage the war in the way that they see fit. But of course, a proxy war need not imply that. A proxy war can simply be that the U.S. is attempting to attain certain objectives separate and apart from whether Ukraine itself is victorious or fends off Russia to whatever end. And the U.S. officials have been abundantly clear that that is the intention. I mean, when Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, went on his secret mission to Kiev with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, a few weeks ago, you probably recall what he said, and this sort of made a little bit of a splash, but he said that the intention of U.S. policy was to, quote, weaken Russia militarily so that it can no longer engage in actions akin to the Ukraine invasion. So if the U.S. is attempting to achieve that objective by way of its facilitation of warfare in Ukraine, then that's almost a classic definition of a proxy war. I was on Tucker Carlson's show in March, and I know a lot of people think it's a morally abominable thing to even go on Tucker Carlson.
But I think it's based, actually.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't know that I would use the word base, but I agree that it's a prudent thing to do, at least for me, because Tucker Carlson is one of the vanishingly few people in the kind of corporate media sphere who allows for a diversity of views on subjects such as Russia-related foreign policy issues or whatnot. And I used the term proxy war just in service of making a larger point about something else in that appearance. And I was inundated with denunciations from people claiming that I was parroting Russian talking points, including Media Matters, this, phony watchdog, quote unquote, organization that is run out of the Democratic Party sort of institutional apparatus in DC. They were saying, this was, my statement there was just more evidence that Tucker Carlson is peddling Kremlin propaganda or whatnot. But the irony being that the first time I heard that term spoken publicly by anybody of stature was from Leon Panetta, the defense secretary and CIA director under the Obama-Biden administration. He said, whether we want to admit it or not, it's a proxy war. And I'm not sure why Leon Panetta would be lying about that. So do you think that he's just gravely mistaken, or maybe as the guy who once ran the Pentagon and the CIA, he has some insight into the actual nature of the policy here?
No, I mean, if that's the definition, I mean, sure. But then that would suggest that any time the United States helps a country defend itself, I mean, the United States is engaged in a proxy war because ultimately the United States, like any other country in the world, is only engaged in whatever it does out of self-interest, even if its self-interest very much overlaps. So I mean, if that's kind of the term, I get it, but that's sort of a term that is, I guess that's fine. That's just a term that's sort of clinical as opposed to one that, as I interpreted your use as sort of casting aspersions.
Well, Michael, do you believe in there being a possible win-win situation where, let's say, the United States would have a new trade partner, and at the same time, when a country's invading another one, the United States comes to its aid? Why is that necessarily seen as a bad thing?
I'm sorry, could you restate that?
Sure. Why would you say that it is seen as a bad thing when...
These comments occasionally distract me as they're
Oh,
flying
I would
across the
just put a
screen.
piece of tape over it. I wouldn't worry
Okay.
about it. Everybody subscribe, by the way, now that I have the floor.
Oh,
So
boy.
what I'm trying to get here is that there is this idea that the NATO expansion, more countries going into this Western-leading alliance, that is somehow symbolic of all the worst aspects of Western civilization, as people talk about, whether it's certain things that are going on in education, certain things that may lead people to believe that we're going into some kind of a totalitarian, technocratic state, Great Reset, whatever. Beyond those things, though, I don't know what's so wrong about having countries that want to be part of the Western sphere, that want to be aided by the West in defense against an enemy that wants to take them over. Why is it so wrong for the West to intervene in this case and to help these countries out? That's kind of what I'm getting at here.
Well, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't invoke ideas like, Great Reset or this sort of more far-flung theories that you seemingly attach to people who have reservations about this kind of Western hegemony. But I would say that if you're talking about the propagation of military influence, and we're not just talking about like soft power or, liberalization of trade or whatever, I mean, then those are separate discussions. But in terms of actual raw military power, which is what the U.S. is exerting here in Ukraine, it's not that it's wrong per se. I wouldn't put it that it's wrong per se for Ukraine to seek that assistance. But given that the U.S. is the leading military superpower in the world, and it's the prime mover of NATO, which Russia, rightly or wrongly states that it regards as an existential threat, then doing this constant ratcheting up by way of a proxy war, and I know that term is not wholly accepted, in Ukraine, brings us to a situation that, from the outset of the war, a lot of people who are otherwise extremely hawkish on Russia, like Marco Rubio, were saying, this is the most dangerous period in world history for decades, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that should be jarring. That should, I think, demand of us much circumspection in what is prudent and how our government, meaning the U.S. government, conducts itself in this situation. There doesn't seem to be any prudence along those lines at all. I mean, there's hardly even any debate. I mean, I commend you for hosting this, debate-ish session. But within the sort of mainline sectors of the media, there's basically no dissension at all permitted on this. And if anybody does raise a point of concern about, for example, the provision of $40 billion of additional aid with hardly any debate or consideration, then they're automatically castigated as somehow, pro-Putin, or implicitly that means they're kind of extreme right-wing, or somehow, stealthily pro-Trump, or whatever the sort of ridiculous label that would be slapped upon them is. And I think that climate is kind of conducive, the climate that's been fostered, and it's bipartisan. I think the sort of crazier parts of it probably emanate from the Democratic side at this point, because at least there's a slightly more variety of opinion amongst the Republicans, although it's still sort of bare minimum on that in that party as well. The climate that's been fostered is not at all conducive to the kind of circumspection that would, I think, most people would agree, should be exercised given the gravity of the situation, according to people like, even Joe Biden. You mentioned, Bastiat said in his opening statement that somehow Biden wasn't responsible for escalation because he said that he didn't want to start World War III. Well, that's a pretty low bar, right? It used to be the case not too long ago that even talking about the notion of World War III would have been extremely jarring and disturbing. Like, it was hard, too much of an abstract idea to even really talk about tangibly. And so for Biden to say that Biden hasn't escalated because he at least superficially has said that he wants to avoid World War III kind of set up a situation in the U.S. discursively, kind of in conjunction with with that no-fly zone debate, which I agree sort of has tapered off. That anything short of that, anything short of just wholesale initiation of World War III doesn't actually amount to an escalation. Whereas every week in the U.S. there's another kind of gradation of escalation that keeps mounting. And
I want to make
creating a certain momentum that is going to be extremely difficult to ever rein back, kind of comparable, I think, potentially
Bastiat,
to how World War I started.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't accept the comparison. First of all, the escalation was done by the Russians, who escalated every time they inched one of their tanks or a battalion of their infantry a little farther into Ukraine, right? Every advance of the Russian military is escalation. Every pushback of the Russians back into their corner is de-escalation, because that prevents the Russians from expanding the war to a wider sense. The United States has repeatedly, and it is very important to drive this home, not just once or twice, not inconsistently, but has consistently said, no American troops, no American planes, no direct American involvement. And that is something that has been consistent. I mean, you may say it's a superficial commitment, but it seems like it's a pretty clear commitment. It is also very hard to imagine that, even if you might imagine kind of the most terrible things about the American government and its interests, that it really feels that there's something to be gained through direct war with Russia, especially when the whole policy of the national defense establishment prior to maybe the last year or two was to pivot, focus, the long-awaited pivot to Asia, to focus on China, right? I'm sure there's relatively little interest by comparison in some kind of long-term final reckoning with Russia, which in any event is no longer a Soviet level threat. Its threat is primarily in the fact that it is still able to spoil and to hurt people and cause damage, even though it can't really. As this war seems to have demonstrated, it seems to have a very difficult time achieving tangible military objectives. It can still foment conflict. It can still attack and aggress and threat,
well, they just
as
took
it has continued to do. So the U.S. has, by contrast, done what it has traditionally done in other sorts of conflicts in the past that are like this. It has provided weapons, training, assistance. It has refused to provide American troops. It has been very clear about that. And while it has engaged in some forms of isolation, sanctions, like in the 80s with the Olympic boycott and some of the other diplomatic moves after the Afghan war, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States has not broken off relations with Russia. In fact, it's continued to work with Russia on the deal with Iran. Now, how well that will pan out in the long term remains to be seen. But the fact is that even as the United States is engaged in a proxy war, and I'd agree with that from a clinical sense, I'm not denying that. I was taking issue with the way it seemed like you were presenting it. But even as it's done that in Ukraine, it has still been working with Russia and Iran. So the notion that this is particularly unprecedented, I don't think so. The one thing I would say that is a little different here is that we're in Europe as opposed to Asia. But that itself is something that makes the American role even more important. Because what the United States is doing in its work here with its allies to keep Ukraine supplied and give Ukraine the tools that it needs to defend itself for so long as it chooses is to prevent the Russians from expanding their conflict to other parts of Europe. The Russians attacked Georgia. They leveled Chechnya before that. They attacked Ukraine in 2014 for the seizure of Crimea, the seizure of the separatist areas, war in Donbass.
Transnistria.
So, and of course, Transnistria. Yeah, and thanks for the tip on that. Transnistria in 1993, like I mentioned, in Moldova.
Yeah.
So, the American role, I think, has been helpful in preventing what the last 100 years have shown is just this general notion that when Europe catches fire, America trying to stay aside ultimately only leads to more problems down the line and the requirement that America commit even more treasure and eventually its own blood to try and stop the conflict. Because unfortunately, it seems like the American experience in the last 2 centuries have shown that America is eventually dragged into these kind of conflicts one way or another. What we're doing in Ukraine, I think, by keeping the Russians from overrunning the country, is helping ensure that we don't have to have some direct conflict with Russia down the line if they try to attack Baltic states or Poland, or if they started attacking American shipping like too many unhappy countries have attempted to do in the past, whatever. This is, I think, good policy in the long-term sense for America, and it happens to overlap completely with the interests of at least the democratically elected Ukrainian government, and by all accounts, the feelings of most of the Ukrainian people who do want to resist the attempted Russian conquest of their country.
Democratically elected government that was pretty much, sorry, you go ahead, Michael, then I will have a longer point.
Well, yeah, just a couple things. I mean, you sort of repeatedly reference Biden's putative assurances that there will be no boots on the ground, and cited that as an example of him supposedly de-escalating rather than escalating. First, I would just note that there's a long history of U.S. presidents claiming that they're going to resist pressure to deploy U.S. troops in a variety of scenarios, and then push comes to shove, and they ultimately end up doing so. And just a few examples off the top of my head is Obama during the ISIS war said there would be absolutely no boots on the ground in Syria, and there of course were boots on the ground ultimately in Syria, then including some that sustained casualties. The early stages of the Vietnam War, I mean, that was dominated by this whole pretension that Eisenhower was just sending advisors and they were just doing training. And of course, as anybody who's even glancingly familiar with that whole chronology knows, it escalated from there. I mean, it wasn't overnight. It would spread over the course of years. I mean, we're only 2.5 months into this now, so I don't think anybody should have much confidence that those initial assurances on the part of the president about supposedly resisting U.S. deployment of troops are going to hold. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but given the track record of American presidential rhetoric, it's not something that I would have much confidence in. Even Woodrow Wilson campaigned for office initially when he first ran on keeping the U.S. out of the war, and then there was a giant about face on that issue, and of course Wilson then brought the country into the war. That's going too far back in history.
We kind of discuss some of these examples back and forth, because I know we've kind of been going on a little longer. So if that's okay with you, So I get what you're saying, but there are a couple of things I'd say about that. First of all, the President Obama, just as a small aside in Syria, I mean, President Obama made the opposite mistake in Syria when he said, we'll draw a red line, and if there's a chemical attack, we will go in. And of course, when the chemical attack happened,
that was a separate.
He refused. That was a separate thing. But I think that's also a little more of a complex issue because ISIS turned out to be something that spread across borders, and I think it's a little more complex. I think the Cold War analogies, though, are a little more interesting. You are right that, for example, Eisenhower, I think was the first president in Vietnam, had no interest in sending American troops there. Kennedy, I think, at one point prior to his assassination, had talked about or mused on the possibility of removing the advisors we had there. And then, before you know it, the Vietnam War has tens of thousands of Americans being drafted to fight there. I do think, though, that there are a couple of important differences between that and the other kind of Cold War wars. First of all, they were the exception as opposed to the rule. America provided a lot of supplies and assistance to a lot of countries around the world during the Cold War, and direct involvement of American troops was the exception, not the rule during the Cold War. And it's also worth noting that, of course, fighting North Vietnam or fighting North Korea, that's a world apart from, say, fighting Russia directly, a nuclear power directly. So I think I would trust the word of the president on that a little more than at baseline, if only because it's pretty clear that the risks there, as we all seem to agree, are a lot different. And then finally, Woodrow Wilson is actually kind of an interesting example because I think Woodrow Wilson and maybe you could argue a little bit about FDR, but I don't even know if I'd argue with him. But certainly Woodrow Wilson really tried to stay out of the war. That was his whole campaign promise. And the Germans had to start blowing up American ships. And then in the end, they threatened to join with Mexico to invade the southwestern United States and retake Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. That's what it took to bring America into World War I. And it took a while to bring America into World War II as well. So the notion that this country is just kind of always chomping at the bit to send troops, I don't think is fair or really accurate. And I think it's kind of a reflection of sort of the feelings of a lot of people toward maybe the Bush administration and its mistaken use of military forces around the world, rather than a real reflection of, American foreign policy for the last 100 years.
Well, I don't think that most Americans are necessarily chomping at the bit to deploy troops in Russia, although it sort of depends how you ask the polling question. There is large-scale support, seemingly on a bipartisan basis, for at least the arms provision component of U.S. policy, whereas there's less seeming support for the option of deploying troops if it were to mean war. But I think that it's probably also the case that there are divisions within the administration, the national security apparatus, about how eager they are to really fully escalate even further the U.S. commitment to Ukraine. I mean, maybe Biden is probably less inclined toward that personally than some others. I mean, it's always sort of a grab bag of people with different predilections in this in any given administration, given the expansive sort of scope of the national security apparatus. But the point is, once the ball is rolling, it kind of is hard to reverse the momentum. And the momentum now, I think it's pretty clear, and I don't know how this could be disputed, is that it is one of ineluctable escalation without any desire, it appears, to reverse course at all. And so, even if there might not be this kind of burning desire on the part of various Biden administrations to launch the war, that doesn't mean that the war couldn't ultimately be launched, given maybe some incident takes place that we can't foresee at the moment. There's some miscommunication. Russia decides to go further than it already has in attacking these supply lines of U.S. or NATO weapons being transported into the country. So, I wouldn't be blasé about that potentiality, at least given this overall trajectory of just more and more escalation. I mean, where is the diplomatic effort? Where is anything that is geared toward reducing hostilities rather than increasing them? And just one last point. I think it actually is worth digging in a little bit semantically on how Bastiat defines the term escalation. Notice what he did, and it's kind of an interesting bit of lawyerly jujitsu that I commend him for. But he's saying it's de-escalatory to escalate the intensity of the warfare that the U.S. is facilitating because of some overarching objective that warfare purportedly achieves, right? So he's saying it's not escalation for the U.S. to provide more and more high-grade weaponry to a warring party that's waging a war, where I think most people in a commonsensical way, if you ask them, is it escalatory to hand grenade launchers and fighter jets and missile systems to a warring party when that party wouldn't have otherwise had that material? They would say, yeah, that's escalatory. But because the U.S. sort of wants to have this conceit that they're not escalating, it's just Russia that's escalating. So, of course, I would acknowledge, and I think you have to be crazy not to acknowledge this, that when Russia launched the preemptive invasion on February 24th, that was an escalation. That doesn't preclude the U.S. from then subsequently also doing its own escalation.
Well,
I
think you can only obscure that if you do this sort of mental gymnastics around what escalation actually is.
Well, I have a question.
I just don't accept that framing of it. In fact, I don't think most people would if you thought about it. I mean, what you're talking about here, if you've got Ukraine without weapons from America and its NATO allies, is a country that is, for all its bravery, at a fundamental disadvantage from a country, Russia, that has attacked it and is using everything that Michael described and equivalents to everything that America has provided Ukraine. Perhaps not as good in terms of quality, because of Russian weapons, but still, grenade launchers, missiles, all that kind of stuff. What the United States is doing is, if anything, evening things out with the Russians. It's not escalating, though. It is providing weapons to the Ukraine so they can defend themselves. It's no more an escalation. It's no more an escalation than if you see somebody being attacked and you provide them the means to defend themselves.
Okay,
but wait.
Maybe this is needlessly kind of nitpicky, but I actually think it's worth again drilling down a little further just to clarify some of the principles here. So if I hand a howitzer to a military unit that wouldn't have otherwise had the howitzer, and my intent in handing them that howitzer is to facilitate their ability to wage more intensified warfare, have I taken an action that escalated the severity of the warfare that's being undertaken, or de-escalated the severity of the warfare?
No.
Because I think my whole point in giving the howitzer to the unit was so that warfare would be escalated in a direction that I find to be felicitous.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I thought you.
Yeah.
The warfare is already intense. The Russians are already bombarding the Ukrainians with howitzers. The Ukrainians now have the ability to bombard back, but that's self-defense. We wouldn't call that escalation. Not in any kind of normal context in our lives. It would be like trying to frame, self-defense in ordinary life as a kind of escalation. If somebody happens to help you defend yourselves, no, you're defending yourselves. I think you have a right to self-defense generally. And the fact that somebody no longer has the full run of the mill to be able to kill you with impunity, or to have an easy time killing you, that doesn't mean that you've escalated things by fighting back on equal terms.
I have a question for both of you.
The problem is reframing it.
I think there are limits to these analogies that have to do with like personal behavior. So like sometimes people will bring up the analogy like, oh, if you're criticizing the U.S. policy, you're blaming the woman for wearing a short skirt if she's raped or something. I think there are limitations to this metaphor. But like, let's just go with the metaphor for a second, right? If somebody breaks into my house, they aggress upon me. But if then my neighbor runs into the side door and hands me a bazooka to take out the intruder, I think the neighbor escalated the amount of violence that.
Wow. That's a good neighbor.
The neighbor has reestablished
the event, right?
The neighbor has reestablished or done something to help reestablish the status quo. The American position is not the conquest of Russia.
But the status quo wasn't that there's
a regime.
All right, one at a time. One at a time, gentlemen. One at a time.
I think I haven't.
Okay, go for it, Gio.
The problem, the fundamental issue I think that we're having is that the framing of the war in general and what led up to it. That is the big philosophic issue here. In the sense that, is it a true unwarranted invasion and aggression by Russia, and people using the G word, which I won't say for YouTube algorithm purposes. We have a complex history between Ukraine and Russia. We have, in my estimation, direct interference from 2014 onwards in Ukraine, even before that, from America. You could say that Maidan was a legitimate democratically elected government. Probably not. There was interference by Kolomoisky in tandem with Victoria Nuland and so forth. But furthermore, I think we have to establish what in sort of the justification that Putler has given for the invasion. Now, Lev, you and Putin are both from St. Petersburg, right?
That's right, yeah.
Now, Putin is very much the Russian equivalent of a boomer in the sense that he believes in the sort of unification of the Russian territory. Maybe not exactly like the Soviet Union, but I mean, that fantasy is gone now because we've seen that through help of Western Europe and so forth, that the Ukrainians, that they've established a sense of identity, whether you want to say it's fictitious or not, but it's certainly there. Now, in the beginning of the war, there was good evidence that they probably were going to escalate things in Donbass with ethnic Russians. That was one justification. Another is that repeatedly from the 1990s onwards, we have a situation where America unilaterally has interfered in the affairs of Russia and has, even in the words of someone like an engineer of the economic policy for the 1990s, like Jeffrey Sachs, saying in 1999 that there was one standard for Russia, there was one standard for all the other Eastern European countries. So Russia, in the very speech that Putin gives at the beginning of the war, he says that Western aggression and expansion of NATO is a direct result of what's happening. What he wanted was to pursue an issue of neutrality with Ukraine like he has with Belarus. Now, you could say that Belarus is basically a puppet of the Kremlin. But I think that to frame it as a pure aggression of Russia and not the sequential issues that Russia has with the West is sort of a fallacy because it's the philosophic debate between, are we going to accept that the liberal hegemony, the global American empire, is the only game in town, and that it's the end of history, and that there is an eschatology to the ideology that Washington operates under? Or do we accept that inevitably there will be a multipolar world and that the realpolitik of the situation will prevail?
That is anything you just said justify the invasion of Ukraine. I don't even think Michael would say that. He and I might, I don't mean to put words in your mouth,
I think
he and I might differ in terms of like whether America could have done more to facilitate peace. But it sounds like you're saying, in essence, that the invasion was justified. I don't know. I don't think that's your position, Michael. I don't know how anything you've just said, and correct me if I'm wrong.
But are you saying? But you said that this is not a proxy.
Wait,
let me finish.
What among it does?
But I'm saying.
You're talking about the global American empire. What does that have to? What are you even talking about?
I think where I
wait, what direct existential threat to the Russian position among the world stage?
All right.
No.
All right,
there you go.
Bastiat.
Russia's position on the world stage.
Hold on, everybody.
Is run by and incompetent
All right,
kleptocrat who has.
yes,
Is America not run by an
hold on,
incompetent
Bastiat,
kleptocrat?
It's not.
I gotta answer this one, guys. Guys, everybody,
If
hold on.
If you think America's leadership is as low in quality as that in
Yes,
Russia,
yes, they are.
You're
They are,
subsuming.
yes.
Look,
100%.
I think we're talking in two different.
All right, Bastiat, I gotta answer
What
this one.
Can
You
I-
obviously not-
Wait, hold on. Okay, everybody's talking over each other. I gotta. Geo, hold on, please. Geo, please.
What you're saying is that Russia, one of the poorest countries in the world, is run as poorly as is run as well as the United States. It just doesn't track with anything anybody would think. Nobody would.
I can't see the American leadership from the Bush administration onwards as being anything but competent, but that's
No, but again, I hate saying relative to what, but I would
Russia
say
is
that.
relatively not as poor as Ukraine because of the decisions that Putin has made.
Okay, Gio,
after
hold on.
1990.
I have to answer this one, and this partly is what we were talking before about with Bastiat. So there is this idea that Russia is kind of like a Mary Sue character, where you don't really take into account the things that Russia has done over time, including during the time of Boris Yeltsin, to elicit a very different response from the United States and from the West and NATO than it would have should Russia have taken a different course in its trajectory. So, for example, we talked about the taking over of Transnistria from Moldova during Yeltsin's leadership. There was also the carpet bombing in Chechnya. So there were not to mention the amazing amount of corruption. There were things that you could take a look at as somebody who was from either the Clinton administration or the Biden or the Bush senior administration, where it may have taken a different turn. Maybe there could have been this union together with the United States and America holding hand in hand if certain things would have been improved upon. This is why NATO, for example, has certain things that you have to go through in order to qualify for it, which is why Ukraine, for instance, with these eastern regions always causing a lot of problems, that was one of the main reasons why it was never in NATO to begin with. So the idea that I'm getting here, Gio, is that Russia had a lot of things it had to clean up, and it was only getting worse at that point before it would have been able to live up to these promises, well, quote-unquote promises, that only one administration made to it at that time when it was talking about not expanding NATO. And first of all, it didn't even have the power to say whether or not NATO would be expanded. That would be up to the countries as far as whether they want to go into NATO.
Essentially,
Can I
Western response to
weigh
Ukraine is
in?
doing the Kremlin's work for it.
All right.
Because by this religious fervor, by using
Can we
borderline
let Michael
Nazi
speak?
Germany
Yeah,
tactics
Michael,
against
go
Russia,
for it.
the sort of Russophobia that's
Michael, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, where I do think that there is some value in the context that Gio was trying to elucidate there is, at least by my lights, not providing any justification per se for the invasion. And I think any invasion that is launched on an aggressive basis is not justified, whichever country initiates it. But that it kind of deepens one's understanding of the conditions that gave rise to the invasion, which is helpful, because often what you'll hear in sort of a cliched, reflexive way on the part of U.S. politicians or pundits is that they'll just kind of automatically refer, whenever they're talking about the invasion, to it as an unprovoked invasion. Now, Putin and other Russian officials are pretty clear that they at least are claiming that it was provoked. Now, you can dispute the legitimacy of their claims to have been provoked, or you can deny that the actions that they're citing are actually do constitute genuine provocations. But I think this whole sort of knee-jerk tick where Congress people and whatever will just by rote say that the invasion was wholly unprovoked kind of has the effect politically of placing the invasion in a sort of vacuum where, the conflict started out of nowhere on February 24th when Putin decided to invade, and therefore nothing that the U.S. might have been complicit in the run-up could have had any effect whatsoever on his calculations. For example, and just to take a more recent example, then going back all the way to the early 90s about a NATO expansion, and did James Baker give an assurance to Gorbachev that they wouldn't go 1 inch east or whatever. Even kind of bracketing that, it is the case that over the course of the Trump and Biden administrations, and this is sort of ironic because if you look at popular liberal media, there's still this unwavering belief that Trump coddled Putin or he was even colluding with Putin or a conspirator of Putin's. But sure enough, over the course of Trump's presidency, not only did he obviously start the process of sending lethal weaponry to Ukraine, he signed off on the elevation of Ukraine to this sort of precursor status to full-fledged NATO membership. In 2020, Ukraine became what's called an enhanced partner of NATO, which basically sets the stage for them to eventually complete their accession into a full NATO member state status, should they pursue it and should NATO invite it. And on top of that, so that's just 2020. So that's just less than 2 years ago. And then on top of that, if I was doing some research on this recently, just to refresh my memory, but after the first Trump impeachment, which funnily enough revolved around Ukraine, it's sort of interesting how central this country is that is somewhat obscure to most Americans' lives has become in our daily existences. But after that first Trump impeachment, when supposedly it was this dramatic attack on democracy for Trump to have withheld arms shipments to Ukraine, even though no arms shipments actually ever were delayed, just as a note. Pompeo, the Secretary of State at the time, rushed over to Ukraine to reaffirm America's commitment to its security, and he set in motion what was then concluded by Blinken in fall of last year, and they forged a brand new so-called security partnership between the U.S. and Ukraine, and included in that partnership, including in like the document that accompanied it that laid out the aims of the partnership, was a reaffirmation of what was decreed in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where it said that the intention of the U.S. and NATO was for Ukraine to become a full NATO member. So that was reaffirmed as recently as last fall by the Biden administration. So you can say that maybe Putin might not like that, but it doesn't constitute enough of a provocation to warrant an invasion. And I would probably agree in that I wouldn't regard it as a justification for the invasion. But to just strike all that from the record and just reflexively say it was totally unprovoked and there's nothing that the U.S. could have possibly done that might have created the conditions that gave rise to this invasion, I think essentially has the function of whitewashing a lot of the historical record on this.
Before Bastiat, I have a question for Michael. I have one question for Michael first.
Okay.
Here's my question. Sorry, Bastiat, real quick. My question for Michael is, what would you have done if you were in the place of the American government at the time? Because I think the fear is that if certain things are not done in order to defend these countries from countries that have demonstrated time and time again to be incredible aggressors, then those countries are going to, just like what happened in Georgia, they're going to see, we can proceed further. There were tanks that were going into the capital of Georgia, even after southern Ossetia, before George W. Bush kind of put a stop to that. So the idea here is that it seems like this country of Russia seems to want to gain more and more and more and more, and unless something is done to prevent that, it's going to keep going. So what would be kind of like the other way of doing this, if not for all these things you mentioned with bringing Ukraine closer to NATO? So let me know.
Well, it's funny. I just recently read a book called Spoils of War by Andrew Coburn, which is very interesting and kind of gets into the history of these kind of moneyed interests that, for example, lobbied for NATO expansion throughout the 90s and other aspects of sort of expansion of the defense industrial base in the U.S. But one anecdote that he relays based on his source, who was a former Bush administration official in 2008 during the Georgia war, was that apparently Bush personally reprimanded Saakashvili, who was the leader of Georgia at the time during that war, and instructed him not to press forward with any kind of aggressive strike on Russia, because according to Bush, that could potentially result in World War III. So, based on this whole kind of escalation two-step that we're talking about in terms of the semantics of that term, you could say that because George W. Bush at that time warned against full-fledged escalation into World War III, that he somehow is de-escalating the situation, even though he just got out of a NATO summit in 2008 where he allowed Cheney to run rampant and express his long-standing dream of having NATO fully in the American sphere of military influence, but having Ukraine rather fully in the sphere of American military influence, even though they knew that would be a drastic provocation against Russia. I mean, even the current CIA director, William Burns, when he was ambassador to Russia, sent a memo back homebound in 2008 and said that everybody knows that this is a firm red line for the Russian establishment, not just Putin, but people around him, including people maybe who are more Western friendly, such as a Medvedev or whomever. So this was well known, and yet they pressed forward with it anyway, again, as recently as last fall. So I don't know how you can just call that somehow not a provocation, even if you don't think it justified the war. Now, in terms of what I would have done, well, number one, I wouldn't have run for office, so I have this decision-making power in the first place. I think people got to be somewhat messed up in the head to even seek this power, and it's not a role that I would want to be in. And I'm not generally inclined to just disperse advice to the people who preside over the military industrial complex. So I don't know what they would have done because I never would have. I don't accept many of the premises underlying the current national security state of the United States. So
but if you hate the situation, you have an alternate view of what should have been done, right? Like have an alternate.
What should have been done when exactly?
What should have been done in general as far as a policy to de-escalate the tensions in Russia? So in your opinion, for example...
As of when? Is it this year or last year?
Well, we could take it all the way back from the beginning if you want, but more of the general idea that whatever the United States does to, let's say, encourage... And again, I think it's less the United States, it's more other countries that want to be a part of NATO. But whatever goes in that direction, according to you, would create more tensions between Russia and the rest of the countries around it. So what would you do to de-escalate that? It's not like you would, if you were the United States, I don't know if you'd have the power to tell all these other countries after the fall of the USSR, like, hey guys, don't join NATO. God forbid you make Russia mad. What exactly would be done in this case if the countries want to be defensive against Russia?
Well, I wasn't old enough to be politically conscious at the time, but I doubt if I were of age in the 90s that I would have been all gung-ho about NATO expansion, given the breadth of warnings that were being issued by everybody from George Kennan, basically the founder of the U.S. Cold War strategy, to Chomsky, to Kissinger, to people across the ideological spectrum who probably wouldn't otherwise agree on anything, who were saying, look, this is a bridge too far and is eventually going to lead us into some sort of confrontation with Russia. And they were right. I mean, their prophecies were actually right. So I think, understanding that, I probably would have not tried to enrich my buddies at Raytheon or General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin or BAE or whatever, because they want to enhance the, quote, interoperability of these new NATO member states and sell them a bunch of weapons and make a lot of money. That probably would not have been what I would be setting out to do. In terms of other stuff that I might have done to perhaps result in a better outcome that would be less riven with tension, is that something that I actually did do contemporaneously from 2016 onwards, which was try to highlight how deranged the mania was around this whole theory that now seems a bit quaint. But you may recall that U.S. politics was dominated for several years by the allegation that Trump had been installed illicitly into office by Putin as a Manchurian candidate style infiltrator. And I think that really also poisoned the well in terms of American diplomatic relations. Even with Russia, you even had it being professed that it was going to be criminalized to have quote unquote Russian contacts. I mean, the whole reason why Mike Flynn had to resign as national security director was that he was supposedly lied, that he simply had a meeting with the Russian ambassador and said, look, we're not going to hold off on escalating these sanctions that the Obama administration.
I want to make sure that we're getting a little bit into the weeds here. We're getting a little bit into the weeds. I want Bastiat to respond.
Lev, I gotta say, Lev, Gio, I mean, it's impossible for he and I to go back and forth if we're just constantly going on tangents randomly, so we gotta go one point at a time here, don't we? So first of all,
that was
if you're gonna talk about like provocation, all right, provocation. If your point, Michael, is that at the end of the day, maybe we don't think it's a legitimate provocation. Okay, I get your point. But I mean, I think as far as anything can be objective, the notion that a country choosing its own military alliance, a defensive military alliance, choosing to be a member of a defensive military alliance is a legitimate provocation against Russia, a country that has historically conquered all of its neighbors several times throughout its history, including most recently in the 20th century. The idea that this would be a legitimate provocation, I think, is ridiculous. I don't even think you would say that's a legitimate provocation, even if you might say, well, we should understand, though, that that's how the Russians are going to react. But that's a different issue. It is one thing to say. It is one thing to say.
Let Bastiat finish.
I'm trying to one at a time. No, got one at a time here. It is one thing to say, hey, look, we have an idea of how the Russians will respond. It is another thing to say it is the Russians are justified in responding this way. I can appreciate the idea that any sort of expansion of American influence, say in Eastern Europe, would be interpreted by the Russians as treading on their sphere of influence that they feel entitled to. I don't think that means that they have a right to some sphere of influence there. I don't think that that's a legitimate feeling on their part. I can understand, though, if you're saying, well, we should have known that they might respond in certain ways, maybe. But when somebody says this is an unprovoked invasion in the sense that there is no legitimate provocation, I think that's absolutely true. Now, it may be the case that we could say, well, if we look back at the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, maybe there are things we would have liked to have done differently. For example, the Bush administration pulled out of certain arms limitation treaties in ways that were unilateral, in ways that probably were not helpful in terms of needlessly deteriorating the relationship to pursue weapon systems that ultimately didn't go too far. I could see areas where I might objectively say that the United States contributed to a worsening of the relationship, but to say overall that America is, and I'm not even sure you're saying this, but this seems to be sort of almost by implication, the idea that America overall has provoked a conflict with Ukraine, when at the end of the day, what the United States has done is supply Ukraine with the resources, the political opportunity, through keeping the door open at some point in the future to join NATO, in essence, through helping Ukraine realize its own political ambitions, not to attack Russia, but ultimately to defend itself from an attack by Russia that began in 2014 and has continued today, only to borrow a word, escalate in February of 2022. So, I think that's one thing I want to say, that there is no legitimate provocation here. You could say that there's a provocation from the Russian point of view. I don't think that's reasonable, though, given the way that ultimately Russia, I think, knows full well, just as we all know, that there is not going to be any NATO attack on Russia. Russia's a nuclear power, and that obviously makes the thought of doing such a thing incomprehensible, just a ridiculous thing to imagine. I think instead the Russians understand quite reasonably that membership in NATO means that the Russians cannot attack a NATO member country because they invite the same kind of devastation. And as a result, when they talk about NATO expansion, they're not talking about it in the sense of feeling like they're threatened by NATO. They are frustrated by the fact that they no longer have as much authority to dominate their neighbors as they have dominated them over the last, few hundred years. I mean, it's actually been 100 years since the last time Ukraine waged a war of independence against Russia after the First World War. Russia attempted to conquer them, and after several years, finally succeeded. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine is some integral piece of some Russian sphere that country has a right to. So I think that's an important thing, first of all. Just to
Can I respond to that?
That's not legitimate. It may be a provocation from the point of view of some people who have a different geopolitical view that doesn't place any value on a independent democratic Ukraine, but that does not make it a legitimate provocation. And frankly, I think the fact that somebody might look at NATO expansion and see that as a source of enrichment alone, I think is also disingenuous. I mean, defense contractors.
I didn't say it was enrichment alone. I said it includes an enrichment incentive, doesn't it?
I think that's. I
mean, does anybody get enriched by NATO expansion?
I think again that's sort of casting aspersions. I mean, first of all, to say.
Well, I mean, okay, so I'm not casting aspersions. I'm just asking as a matter of fact.
So was Russia not?
Wait, one at a time. One at a time.
Western-backed oligarchs. Was Russia not looting?
I mean, have you looked at the
hold on, one at a time, please.
These defense companies lately?
Yeah. Defense companies, they do trade stocks. Their stocks go up, their stocks go down. They're not
they're
actually particularly well connected though to war.
Wait. Sorry.
Fashion. But when you say enrichment, the way it seemed to me was that you were casting NATO expansion as being, when you described it sort of passively, as the purpose of it was enrichment of American defense
value judgment. I just as a matter of fact.
If you're saying that's just
are there
interests that stand
to profit from?
No, Gio, we can't have people talking over each other.
That is a comparatively, though, indifferent consideration compared to the much bigger issues of why countries would join an alliance like NATO, or why the United States might, along with its allies, offer membership in NATO.
For example, these countries, why the behemoth defense companies in the U.S. that employ teams of lobbyists to run around D.C. advocating for their interests might be really in favor of more NATO expansion? Does it explain perhaps their motivation?
Their motivation is one motivation among many. They're one interest group among many. And we're not just talking about interest groups in the United States.
But enrichment could be part of their motivation,
about interest groups in over 30 countries.
All right, I want to switch.
If you're saying, is that a part of it? Sure, that's a part of it.
All right.
And indeed, I think that's a legitimate part of it. Because we want defense contractors to be able to make money so they can produce good weapon systems so the United States doesn't have to worry about
where you and I
might
maybe differ a bit, because
I don't think we do differ.
I agree with Eisenhower.
We really differ on the notion that we should not have the best weapon systems in the world if we're going to have a military. I mean, surely we at least want to be able to defend ourselves, even if you and I might disagree on how extensive that military presence should be in the rest of the world. Presumably, we want to have at least the best stuff for ourselves.
I mean, I think a lot of these weapons programs are complete boondoggles and are gradually revealed to be as such over time. So, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm just going to give a blanket approval to anything that Lockheed Martin thinks is going to be in the U.S. national defense interest to manufacture. But just to quickly go back to the point that you're making about whether it's a legitimate provocation or not, or how do you distinguish between maybe Russia acknowledging that Russia believes itself to have been provoked, but it wasn't a legitimate provocation. I think there's that's sort of the tricky thing to disentangle there, because partly it stems from something that you actually said, Bastiat, at the outset of your most recent remarks, which is that you said, NATO is a defensive alliance. That's a cliche we hear all the time when politicians in the U.S. and elsewhere try to defend the, mission, so to say, of NATO. They say, it's a defensive alliance. So how in the world could anybody potentially feel threatened by it or imperiled by it? And, I think that's pretty much just that, a cliche. I mean, who is it defending? Who is NATO defending in Libya? I mean, who is it defending in Serbia? I mean, there are plenty. You're defending
Bosnian people from an attempted genocide by the Serbian state.
But I thought when you say defensive, it means
it's defending the peace of Europe from the attempt by one regime to
so
arming
is
in a place where the first
Assad regime.
Yeah, it wasn't defending any NATO member states, because by that logic, you can say that anyone who needs defending anywhere in the world, NATO can come to their aid, right? Because I thought the whole point of what defensive means in this context is defending the NATO member states themselves. Yeah, and there was no direct defensive interest in Serbia or what about Libya? How was it operating defensively there?
I mean, I think it's quite clear that when governments collapse and there's a large-scale genocide, a large-scale
what NATO member state was good?
What genocide? What genocide?
Libya, and gee, I'm trying to tell Michael here.
Well, first of all, I've been muted, so that's I mean,
because there were three people speaking at once.
So I mean, when states,
I'm uniquely muted though,
because they were already speaking.
Yeah, when states like that, collapse, Europe has faced waves of refugees, and that causes all kinds of political instability. I mean, these are areas right on the periphery of NATO member states. I mean, if you want to say that it's not defense in the sense of a military attack, well, that's also why Article 5 was not invoked. I mean, that's a different kind of agreement among NATO members, but not exactly a NATO operation in the same way that, say, when the United States was attacked on 9/11, it invoked Article 5, and that was a clear attack on the United States. It led to a clear NATO response, as opposed to, something a little more general, where you're talking about, some NATO members cooperate on a shared interest and they use a NATO framework, but that's like Serbia or Libya, that's a different kind of thing. What we're talking about with Russia is the risk of an attack from the entire alliance against a country with 6,000 nuclear weapons. And that's just not going to happen, because even in these smaller situations you've described, that required NATO to go through its own process. It has sent to this stuff somewhat democratically in its own kind of voting fashion. Its members get a vote and all that. I mean, that's just not going to happen, right? America's allies are not going to vote to go to war with Russia. They might, with Libya, but war with Russia is an entirely different concept. Everyone knows that. The Russians know that too. We all know that. We know that there is nobody in our country, and certainly not in Europe, who is actively hoping for our NATO countries to go to war with Russia. We all know at this point now that Russia would be very quickly humiliated and would have to resort to nuclear weapons. So it's
all right.
Well,
Okay, go on, Jim.
I mean, this is the fundamental point. I think the philosophic disagreement here is that what you're saying, you're approaching it from this sort of post-Westphalian legalistic framework where countries are their own contained units, but you are ignoring the externalities of the history between Ukraine and Russia, that region of the world being largely part of Russia and having ethnic Russians at least half of the population in it. That is the huge problem that complicates the thesis that they are a totally 100% sovereign nation. Now, I'm saying is justifying Putin's his actions he's committing, but I'm saying that the crime of that they just want to join NATO and so forth. I mean, this is ignoring the actual real political implications of the way that these alliances operate. This is what we're saying. Now, that is the problem. As for the other point about, I forget. I mean, this very slippery debate.
Well, it's a good thing. It's a good thing, actually.
Let me just say something really quick.
All right.
I think your whole spiel there, which again was well constructed, speaks to the clear elasticity in what is meant by this term defensive, right? Because I would think that would be assumed to generally mean, when it's popularly understood, to mean that defensive in terms of defending NATO states that come under attack. And to claim that applied somehow to Libya, I think is a massive stretch. We even have recently Liz Truss, who I mentioned before is the Foreign Secretary of the UK, is saying that NATO needs to come to the defense of Taiwan. So now we're going to the other side of the world, nowhere near the North Atlantic, to apparently undertake yet another defensive mission. So if that concept of defense is so expansive that it can basically justify anything that the NATO member states want to do in terms of aggressive military action, then I think it kind of collapses into absurdity, which is why, in terms of the provocation against Russia being legitimate or not, they clearly don't accept that NATO is a strictly defensive alliance. I mean, who is NATO arrayed against? Who is it defending against, if not Russia? So when you're talking about the legitimacy or not of the provocation, I think if you are operating on the assumption that it is strictly defensive and would never dream of potentially encroaching on Russia at any time, then that sort of resolving that question hinges a lot on the whole wider question of the legitimacy of the provocation. I mean, NATO constantly holds drills and exercises in direct proximity to Russia. There was a huge NATO exercise just last summer that was, for example, part of which, for example, took place in Estonia, which is on the Russian border. So, if there are drills taking place on your actual border, can you legitimately regard that as a provocation? I don't know. I mean,
would Poland be afraid? Would Poland be afraid of the United States invading it?
But it's not crazy, is it?
Well, would Estonia be afraid of the United States invading it? Would any of these countries that have their shit together, pardon my French, worry about the United States invading them? I think that this is a big problem here.
They've already been invaded, Lev.
Well, that's a whole different thing. Because when we were talking about invasion in terms of having more, liberal values, things like that, that's a whole other conversation which I don't want to get into right now, and which I support, by the way. But the idea that you have a country like Russia that's worried about NATO invading it. I could tell you this. If there was some kind of an operation later on to influence the votes or whatever, to influence people, to have somebody replace Putin with somebody who would be more favorable for not having a dictatorship in Russia, I would be for that. I don't think common sense people would be against that whole idea. And it always comes back, whether we're talking about Russia or China, what are the things that people are the most concerned about with these countries doing? So let's say we imagine, for example, going with Michael's idea of de-escalating. What would happen if, for example, I mean, now it's too late, but let's say, for example, in the beginning of this war, what would have happened if the United States would have not done anything, would have de-escalated, would have lived up to the wet dream of isolationists, and would have just kept to its own being? What would Russia do? That's my question for Michael.
Well, I mean, it's sort of in a way, it's an incoherently premised question, because the U.S. has never been isolationist, especially with regard to Ukraine. Rather, in the lead up to this war, years in advance, it's been exercising its interventionist tendencies in Ukraine, which then kind of set the context for why Russia at least said that it chose to invade. And I've given examples of that with that security arrangement that was brokered last fall. I mean, the U.S. had already been well on its way into essentially converting Ukraine into a de facto military outpost of the U.S. That's why they were holding these drills constantly and exercises on Ukrainian territory. That's why they keep constantly talk about this supposed interoperability between the U.S. military and the Ukraine military, so they could basically engage in joint operations together, including combat operations, as we're seeing now with this supposed intelligence sharing arrangement that the U.S. has with the Ukrainian military over the course of the war. So, I mean, I think I'm not sure what.
No, but this is very simple. What would Russia do if there was less pressure on it?
It's not just isolation. I mean, how about just the U.S. choosing not to undermine every potential avenue for diplomatic accord, which they definitely did, at least once.
All right, let's play this out. What would happen then? What would happen if it would not undermine this diplomatic situation with Russia? What would Russia do? How would Russia act?
They do the hard work of trying to come to some sort of ceasefire, right? We don't hear anybody talking about a ceasefire anymore in the U.S. government. We occasionally hear it from people, leadership in France, and then they get maligned. In the U.S., nobody even talks about it as a viable thing to pursue because they're so preoccupied 100%. With getting the latest weapons package ready, $40 billion this week.
Why would anyone pursue a ceasefire with Russia if they thought they could push Russia out of the territories that the Russians have taken, are executing civilians in, especially given the way that the Russians tore and shredded the
Why would anyone want to prefer to cease hostilities rather than perpetuate them?
Because they'd like to push the Russians out of their country. This is what is so really beguiling. Michael, by
is that a realistic? Oh, here comes the emotional plea.
Gio,
here comes the emotional plea.
Gio, come on.
Gio, I'm trying to have a one-on-one here. I don't know anything about you. I'm trying to talk
yes.
to Michael here because we have distinct worldviews, and you're coming in talking about the gay American empire. It doesn't mean anything. So, Michael, look,
doesn't mean anything.
Gio,
I get what you're saying about diplomacy. I get that, but
very good.
It's just by implication to say the United States has frustrated all attempts at diplomacy. I mean, that's just not true. The United States tried
what
to
direct diplomacy did Biden engage in with Putin prior to the war?
For that,
the U.S. talked him out of it.
Here's the other thing. Your point there is just so mistaken. The United States should not be engaging in one-on-one diplomacy about the fate of Ukraine. The United States should be working with its allies and working with Ukraine to do that, rather than doing it one-on-one and presuming. No, the United States should not engage in one-on-one diplomacy about Russia or
so
about
Biden
Russia's
and
invasion
Putin shouldn't be on the phone.
This is a religious expression from Bastiat right now. This is the religiosity
Biden, Ukraine, NATO, Europe, all the interested parties should be involved. But the Russians have historically had as their primary foreign policy goal the division of the United States from its allies in Europe. And that's why Russia repeatedly attempted to make demands on the United States specifically, that the United States specifically keep Ukraine out of NATO. It's a specific attempt to divide America from its allies, from Ukraine, to leave each of these countries isolated so that Russia can take them at its leisure.
This is wait. Please, hold on, everybody.
So the idea that the United States was doing some kind of, preventing peace by not trying to negotiate direct with Russia. That's just not true. That in fact would have made it likelier that Russia would have felt more comfort to take on Ukraine free of any kind of intervention. At the end of the day, the Russians lie every time with respect to these negotiations in Ukraine. How can you negotiate with a country that just says we're not going to invade, right? And then invades? Their word is worth nothing. And obviously, until the facts on the ground are such, the people of Ukraine feel like they can make peace with Russia. Russia is going to continue to attempt the war, and any kind of negotiation is going to be, we certainly hope that Ukraine, can negotiate a good peace. But the idea that the only thing preventing peace is the United States, that's just not true. The only kind of peace that happens, to answer Lev's question, if America disengages, if America stops supplying Ukraine, is the peace of surrender to Russia. And we both know that's the case. We both know that Russia otherwise would have continued to negotiate and would not have invaded Ukraine. It did that because that was its plan the entire time. It just wanted to try and separate America from Europe first.
Wait, before we go on further, hold on, please, Gio, hold on, please. Before we go on further, I just want to say a couple of things. Number one, Gio, you put me in the kind of a weird situation here because when there are two people, Gio, please, when there are two people speaking, and then you speak, that's like cars, with the right of way, not knowing which car has to go first. No. When Bastiat was speaking, then you were speaking, and multiple times. You put me in a weird situation where you wrote that if I were to mute you one more time, then you were going to leave. And here's the thing.
Like when we had Scott Greer on, this is what happens, Lev. You stonewall because you are obviously a biased.
No, here is how I want to do it. No, Gio,
Bastiat
please.
thinks I'm a jerk off. And not integral to the show.
Gio, you help a lot in the show, but here's how I want to do it. I want Bastiat to speak, then I want Michael to speak, and then I would want your response as well. What I don't want is to have somebody speak and then somebody else interrupting while they're speaking. I think that's very fair, so let's do that from now on. I would love to get a response from Michael to what Bastiat said right now. Again, I want to specifically focus on what are some of these bad implications that Bastiat has been talking about as far as what Russia would do and keep on doing as far as acquiring more territory. There were examples that was shown of Russia doing this in the past. I think this is what people from Bastiat's and my perspective are the most concerned about here. We don't want a country like Russia to keep acquiring more territory if everybody just decides to sit on their ass and not do anything about that. And I don't really see a way out of that. So I don't know, like Michael, that's the situation I'm trying to solve here. And I want to approach this in good faith. I want Gio to respond as well, but I want to make sure we don't step on each other's toes. So here's how: Michael, then Bastiat, then Gio. Let's do it in that order. Okay, go for it, Michael.
Well, Bastiat. Bastiat just executed another clever little logical construction that I think is worth parsing a bit. He seemingly acknowledged when I asked him that Biden did not engage in any direct diplomacy with Putin. And according to Bastiat, it was a good thing that Biden didn't do that because it would have somehow emboldened Putin to continue pursuing his aims in Ukraine, or something to that effect. But that is a concession that the U.S. did not pursue a certain diplomatic avenue that could have been potentially available to avert the war. In the lead up to the war, you had this very curious dynamic that very few people seem to really intelligently comment upon or point out, which is that every time that Blinken or some of these other officials were asked about the concept of the NATO open door policy, they would on the one hand say that, we are so stridently committed to the maintenance of this policy that of course we would never even dream of potentially giving it up as a matter of a negotiation concession with Russia. But they would then say that, of course, also Ukraine is not at all likely to join NATO at any point in the near future. So why was it that they were so zealously intent on not codifying into some sort of firm assurance what they were saying wasn't going to happen anyway, which is that NATO was not going to accept Ukraine as a member, right? So that is a potentially big diplomatic avenue that could have been pursued that was cut off by the Biden administration for reasons that haven't really been, I think, adequately probed. So, when you're talking about how potentially this could have been averted, and you're saying that the U.S. had no real role in, setting into the chain of events into motion that led to the invasion. Well, that's just one example of, I think, a role that they did most certainly have, because it's not just when you're talking about U.S. being a negotiating party here. I mean, there's a reason why this is never going to be resolved just through bilateral negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, or at least it seems extraordinarily unlikely that would be the case, because the U.S. is such a central player in all this. I mean, you can go through counterfactuals where the U.S. didn't over time convert Ukraine into a de facto military outpost, or didn't arm the military and subsidize it, and basically engage in nation building in Ukraine post 2014, where it even got into the minutia of helping to plan the parking layouts in Kiev. Go look up the USAID document. I'm not kidding. The U.S. has been nation building and subsidizing the military of Ukraine since 2014. And so it's hard to really engage in a counterfactual about the U.S. role that departs from that, because that's just what the situation was. That was a core condition that gave rise to what eventually resulted in the invasion. But because the U.S. is such a prime mover, it must be party to the negotiations, and its word goes an enormous way in sort of dictating the terms of whatever the negotiation is going to be. So when the U.S. goes out of its way, sorry if there's some background noise, if the U.S. goes out of its way, as it did at the end of March, when there seemed to be a potential window of opportunity for a negotiated settlement, right? I don't know if you recall this, but around the time when Russia said, okay, we're doing this partial withdrawal from around the Kiev area, and we're going to reorient our strategy to the east or whatever, there was a report in the Financial Times not long ago that at that period in late March, Putin was at least tentatively, I mean, who knows if this is absolutely true, but it was reported in the FT, okay? Putin was at least tentatively willing to entertain the prospect of a negotiated settlement with Ukraine, after that first phase of the war. And then what happened on the day that those signals were sent? Well, the State Department and the Defense Department simultaneously went out of their way to throw cold water on the veracity of any overtures that Russia might make in accord with trying to arrive at some kind of negotiated settlement. And then, one thing led to another, and all of a sudden, the following day, we get the blow up over allegedly Russia engaging in genocide, and then all potentialities for some kind of negotiated solution are suddenly off the table, and the U.S. is then dead set wholly on escalating in a whole variety of different ways. That's the course the U.S. has chosen. I'm curious to hear Bastiat comment, particularly on the issue of the NATO door policy and why that wasn't codified, or they wouldn't even consider codifying that in hopes of averting the war. Because if you had a choice, right, what would you choose? Codifying what they said was not going to happen anyway in a formal written assurance, as Putin had requested, or having a war? I'm assuming most sane people would probably choose the former option, right? Because we don't want a war, especially one with such a strong potential of potentially escalating into something deeply catastrophic. So, curious what your reaction is to that.
Okay. So, first of all, just to be clear, I totally reject the notion that Ukraine was ever anything approaching a military outpost. And I reject the notion that Russia was talking about a negotiated settlement in good faith. Ultimately, Russia has used lies and deceit to push its military position in Ukraine, as it did in Syria when it talked about ceasefires and routinely violated them. So I think it is very reasonable a month into this war that Russia also lied about not having any intention to start, to say, look, don't change what you're doing just yet, because they might be doing this, to try and keep you basically from, kicking them while they're.
You dispute the Financial Times.
So no, I do dispute the notion that I'm not disputing that the article exists. I dispute the notion that was anything, any kind of a genuine.
You dispute what's reported in the article.
Piece. Yeah, I dispute the notion that was a. Yeah, I dispute the conclusion that you're saying was reported in the article. I don't know that the article is making that. I haven't read that, but I dispute the notion that there's a serious, genuine opportunity for peace there. So I'm going to put that out before I talk about the bigger issue of NATO and the open door policy, because I think that's an interesting point. And I was chomping at the bit, when you brought that up. So I appreciate you talking about it, because it is a good question, right? I mean, war. If you really think that the choice is between war with Russia or excluding Ukraine from NATO on paper in writing, why wouldn't you do that? I think there are a few good reasons why you wouldn't do that. First of all, the only reason any of us were entertaining any kind of written accommodation with Russia or discussion with Russia, and there was some back and forth between the U.S. directly, but on fundamental and Russia directly, but on fundamental questions, the United States said, look, no, we're not going to do one-on-one negotiation about the fate of the alliance or about Ukraine. And I think there's good reason for that. First of all, the only reason such negotiations were at issue is because of Russia's implied threat to, even though it was saying it wasn't going to, it kept putting, it maintained somewhere between 100 and 150,000 Russian soldiers in the border of Ukraine. There is good reason for the United States not to say, well, we know you've put these troops on the border of Ukraine, and it is our position that you're about to invade Ukraine. And as a result of your violent threat, we are going to accede to your demand and put in writing that Ukraine will never be able to choose its military alliance and that we are keeping it out of NATO forever. That's bad, one, because the United States is acceding to violent coercion from a nuclear power that has shown a record of attempting to engage in violent coercion in the past, has a record of pushing as far as it can until it is pushed back upon. So that's a huge point, because that is ultimately just one reason there. That is something that, as a citizen of a democratic country, I certainly do not want my government to be making terms like that under threat and duress in such a fashion as to only encourage future demands now that we would have it in writing on paper that the United States can be pushed around by force. So that's one point. The second point is that the United States is part of...
Can I stop you really quickly just there, and then you can continue?
All right.
Just a very quick interjection of a question. I mean, so if it were the case that had the U.S. offered to accede to that demand, it would have averted the war, would you have taken that trade-off?
No, I would not have. And
so
I don't know.
prefer to have the war?
No, I would prefer not to have the war, and I don't think it was a given that Russia would invade.
But let's say hypothetically that it would have resulted in averting the war.
Would I accept violent coercion in place of a war? No, because the end result is.
Well, I think that's an amazing revelation. Actually,
no, I don't think that is an amazing revelation.
Something on paper if it could have averted.
Lev, they seem to be interrupting each other. Lev, I don't know. Are you going to step in there as a host, Lev?
Michael, that's like saying, look. I mean, if it's down to, if it's down to the annexation of a piece of a territory, or war with that country that you're just seeking to peel that territory off of. I mean, what do you choose? Obviously, you'd rather give up a territory than have a full-blown war, right? Well, no, because the implication is quite naturally, look, if you got away with taking this with no cost, obviously you're going to keep trying. And I'm trying not, by the way, to say, this World War II example, but the logic is the same with all kinds of international disputes. If you're really saying, look, war is to be avoided at all costs, and as a result, we accept this violent coercion, you're just going to end up getting more violent coercion. You're going to end up with a war, and you're going to be in an even worse position for doing so. I think that's an important point. I don't accept the logic that there are that war is the worst of all things. I mean, it is in some sense, but I guess ultimately it's not the. I guess I would say that. While it is war between America and Russia,
wait, hold on. Everybody, hold on a second, please.
It really
please,
says
please.
A lot
We
about
gotta
worldview that you think it could potentially be
beyond
worse
the worldview.
to offer a concession to Russia about a cession of Ukraine to NATO than to have a war. I mean, that's actually very illuminating about how you're thinking.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that it would be better to accede. This is an important, you guys. This is the most fundamental point.
Right.
Not wanting war. I didn't think that was a controversial opinion.
It is. If you're saying that war must be avoided at all costs, even if it means that Russia can threaten us with armed force and extract concessions.
It's not particularly high cost to just codify something that the U.S. government was saying was never going to happen anyway. At least
it wasn't saying it was never going to happen.
Conceivable sense in the near term.
Oh boy!
I mean, you're saying a near-term thing, but that's the other thing. It takes a voluntary association between Ukraine and the other members of, or rather the existing members of NATO, rather. It takes that voluntary decision between those parties, and it adds Russia as a perpetual third party now. Because now that we put it in writing that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, if ever Ukraine should change its mind, now Russia is a legal party to that. Russia now has a very clear claim, right? As opposed to before, where its claim was of its own accord. Now, it is a claim that has been recognized by America, by Ukraine, by hopefully by, I guess, the rest of NATO, so that it's not just something that we've imposed upon them. And that gets to the second point, that America can't negotiate on behalf of NATO all by itself. I mean, this is an alliance of 30 countries. The United States is certainly the biggest one, but it's not the only nation. It's not the only member. It represents, I think, about half to maybe 60% of the military power of the NATO alliance. It represents less than half of the full population of the NATO alliance. But it's not the place of the United States to say, we as the biggest member just get to decide what's what with respect to NATO. And therefore, if Russia tells us, hey, America, you need to guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. Not only then are we subsuming ourselves to violent coercion, but we're also saying this alliance, this is really just an appendage of us. We'll dispose of it as we see fit. And you Europeans just kind of deal with it. That's the other thing. It blows up NATO. Because it says no longer do we collaborate with our NATO members to come to mutual decisions, but rather we impose, and we do so in response to Russian pressure. That destroys NATO.
Before
Michael's credibility of the alliance and the guarantee.
Before Michael's response, I want to make sure, as I promised, Gio, if you have any response you want to give to Bastiat.
I don't have any point. I've been dismissed here.
Gio, don't do that. Don't do that.
Actually, no, don't worry about it. No, because I think we're never going to get through this sort of purposeful lie about the actual role of America in this situation. So I'd be happy to go on and on with you about this maybe afterward. But your point of view is, and I think this is a fair estimation, I think your opposition to my point of view comes from a very different place, I think, than Michael's opposition. I think Michael's opposition is more of he views what I'm saying as warmongering, and I view it as I'm trying to, I think, prevent a bigger war, right? I'm worried that the cost has to be paid somewhere down the line, and I'd like to pay less right now rather than have a bigger war in the future. That's and I think, Michael, I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth when I say it seems like you think that my whole logic here is just bullshit, and really it's just kind of militarism that enriches the defense industry and established political interests, and that's really not a thing. We should really try negotiation instead of just all this rest of the stuff. But what Gio, I think, is saying is, look, this whole this idea of nations is very... it's Westphalian sovereignty. It's all bullshit. Russia
it could be an interesting.
Does have some real rights.
It could be an interesting conversation, but I want to make sure, Gio.
I'm just saying the history of it.
Yeah, but I want to make sure that when there is
the problem is when you actually look at the relations that the West had to in relation to Russia from the 1990s, from the collapse of the Soviet Union onwards. That's my point. But that's. Whatever, that's...
Yeah. So I just want to make sure... that's the whole point, Gio. I want to make sure we understand each other here, that this is not any geo-suppression. This is purely, if Bastiat and Michael are speaking about a particular thing and they're going on and on, I want to make sure that as much as I can help it, that the conversation doesn't steer somewhere else and it's not interrupted. That's all.
Here as to my role...
No, I already told your role.
I don't have a word.
And Gio, I never force you to come on BTR.
Actually, I have to go, Lev, so...
No, but Gio, before you go, I just want you to know, I never forced you to come on BTR. You like to come on BTR, and I appreciate that you come on BTR, but it was never...
that wasn't the arrangement that we discussed.
That was the arrangement. But again, it's like, that is behind the scenes.
All right, see you later.
Oh, man. All right. But anyway, let's get back into it. Here's the thing. I like Gio's views on philosophy stuff and art-related things, and I think he has a good heart on the inside. But I want to make sure that the conversation itself has a very particular point of view in which it goes into between the two of you. So back to that particular discussion, I want to see, Michael, what do you think is wrong with these views of the military of Russia expanding and getting other nations, so on and so forth? Why is that not a realistic way of looking at it, despite all the money grubbing that could possibly come from certain military-industrial complex people? Which maybe that happens, and I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure that has to be worked on. But regardless of that, do you see any other problem with what we were discussing here with this expansion?
Well, when Bastiat was talking, he made a comment about how I appear to believe that his whole view of this situation is driven by a profit motive, right, to enrich the military-industrial complex or something to that effect. And, whenever I talk about that component of American foreign policy, I often make sure to clarify that I really only view it as one sort of layer of this entire edifice that undergirds U.S. foreign policy. And probably most people who are extremely passionate about their particular foreign policy initiative don't regard themselves as just acting from this crude profit motive. And I doubt Bastiat is. He seems to have some very sincerely held convictions. And that's why I think it was fruitful that we isolated what I at least have surmised is a core conviction of his and is an illuminating one as to the rest of his worldview, which is when I kind of presented this bifurcated choice between whether a war would be acceptable. I presented a dichotomy to him. Would you take the deal to codify this taking off the table of the NATO open door policy if it meant averting the war? And he said no. And then he gave a whole variety of reasons stemming from his ideological convictions about why he wouldn't regard that as an acceptable trade-off. And I think that actually is very instructive. I think for me, if I'm presented with an option to either have war or not, it's probably not particularly likely that I'm then going to propose a whole slew of ideological reasons why averting the war is actually not ideal, given the choice at hand. So I think, that also probably reflects on his view about how the concept of escalation is defined, about the role of the U.S., which he doesn't accept has had any kind of escalatory role, and it's all this kind of morally condemnatory depiction of Russia as the overriding kind of force in setting the kind of parameters of the conflict. And so, again, I think if there's any revelation that we have attained here over the course of almost 2 hours, that's it for me in terms of sort of getting to the nub of what distinguishes our sort of just overall mental framework and how we process these issues.
Do you mind if just, I'm curious, because I think that is the interesting point. In fact, I feel like probably I would imagine that's sort of where the Biden administration's thinking is, although I understand why, that's a hard thing to kind of express as public policy. It's, it's kind of complicated, but I think that I don't know
what the Biden
to say the idea. I think it's probably their position to look, we are not willing. I think I probably have just laid out basic in foreign policy. It's like, look, don't divide NATO, and also you don't get to tell us what to do. Maybe we can come out, with a deal of some kind.
Right. So you articulated a
I think it's probably pretty
host
standard
of convictions that people in the Biden administration probably had that caused them to cause their desire to maintain this commitment to the open door policy to supersede their desire to avert the war. And I think the desire to avert the war probably ought to have superseded because having a war is really bad and has all kinds of potentially unforeseen consequences that ought to be avoided if at all possible. And they eschewed that possibility in their diplomatic approach to the pre-war situation.
Now, to be clear, I don't quite accept, I think, the framing you just put out, that I think, even though our hypothetical was either or, to simplify, to kind of get at the priorities, I don't think in reality it was quite either or. Even though the United States, for example, had all this intel that Russia was going to invade, one of the reasons it released the intel was to try and preempt, to try and prevent, to try and say, look, we know what you're doing, don't do this. So I don't think it was quite either or in practice, but I do think there was some sort of logic like that. I'd like to ask you though, is it your conviction that, look, any kind of demand that the Russians make, it's not great, but it's better than a war? I mean, what if the Russians, for example, said, look, we demand the entirety of the claimed territory of the breakaway republics, or we demand kind of this. Now there's some talk about the Cherson in the south and kind of this land corridor to Crimea. Look, these are our territorial ambitions, but you give us these, and we call it no war, peace. We agree. Let peace. Is that better than a war? I mean, I tend to think that ultimately, when you reward that sort of thing, you're just going to get a war down the line in a worse position.
Look, there was a treaty that was signed not just between Ukraine and Russia, but also between other eastern regions around where they denuclearized, and the agreement was that we're going to denuclearize, and because of that, Russia should never be able to go into our territory ever again. That was the idea, but that was broken. So what are these pieces of paper worth at the end of the day if you're dealing with a very hostile nation that doesn't respect those pieces of paper to begin with?
And I guess I'm just to kind of make the question clear. I'm curious whether,
I got your question.
Okay.
I think Perhaps unlike you, I don't have a well-developed, ideologically infused, kind of overarching worldview as to foreign policy where, for example, I love to go, I'm not saying that you necessarily do this, although I could imagine you doing it, or somebody who shares your sensibility, but go around proffering platitudes about the rules-based international order and how we need to ensure democracy prevails, and the fight in Ukraine is this kind of cosmic showdown between good and evil, and democracy versus tyranny, and liberty versus totalitarianism, or whatever. These often strike me as the kind of cliches that people use when what their ultimate ambition is, which it's not really kind of considered couth to express directly, is they want to maintain and expand U.S. hegemony, which is understandable for somebody who has an investment in that hegemonic status, whether from a financial standpoint or ideological standpoint, or just from a basic nationalistic standpoint as a citizen. So whatever angle you're approaching it from, I understand that motive, but it often gets dressed up with these appeals to certain platitudes and cliches that really don't amount to much when you examine them with any degree of specificity. And now, in terms of the question that you asked me, given that unlike perhaps you, I don't have that sort of really determined worldview that I try to graft onto every situation. My kind of core conviction would be, and thank God I'm not in a position where I'm going to be making these judgments on behalf of the State Department or something, but my just sort of baseline, almost moral intuition is that if I'm presented with options that could either result in a war or not, say option A is going to lead to a war and option B isn't, I'm probably going to choose option B. I don't think that's a particularly radical or crazy core conviction. I think most people probably would have it. And you apparently, though, because of the force of your ideological convictions, which you've expressed articulately, would have chosen option A, even if it would result in the war. And I think that, again, as I've tried to emphasize, that really does reveal something pretty central to the differences in how we kind of structure our moral convictions around this range of subjects.
Yeah, I appreciate perhaps it is an interesting framing to call a very well-developed ideological framework. I acknowledge that I do have one, but I think the point I'm making here is not really this point, though. I don't think is really a part of that. It seems to me to be a kind of a sort of simple cost-benefit analysis. If you believe that the Russians will stop when they've made the final demand, they pull the troops back, no more war, and that's it. I suppose if you believe that, then sure. I don't believe that. I don't see any reason to believe it. I don't see any even kind of thinking about things, from a trying to detach myself from that perspective. I don't know how you could look at Russian history and say, look, okay, you just unilaterally gave the condition, and that was the end of it. Now, maybe that's an ideological predilection. I don't think so, though. I think that is a cost-benefit analysis of, look, I think the war is coming either way. I want to, if it's going to come, I don't want to put them in a better position to fight it. And I think that's what you're doing when you give that a condition over. I don't think, though, that that's an ideological conviction. I think that's a cost-benefit kind of risk evaluation.
Well, when you first formulated your view by answering my dichotomistic question,
right?
I didn't get the sense that what was driving you was sort of a simple cost-benefit analysis. It seemed like you had a principled conviction in how deleterious it would be for the U.S. to acquiesce under duress to a Russian demand that basically functioned to curtail U.S. power or influence. Is that not true? Do you not have that conviction?
Yeah, I'll say that.
It seems like that's what you said.
Yeah, I'll say that is a conviction as well. But I think
right. So it's not just a cost-benefit analysis.
I think you could totally detach the conviction and come to the same conclusion. I mean, it's not based on ideology. I happen to believe also that I'm a citizen of a democracy.
But you do
have that
ideology.
Conviction. But I think any citizen of a democracy doesn't want their country to be pushed around, and dictated to by an authoritarian state. And I also don't think it's really an ideological sort of reasoning. I think it's just pretty clear reasoning to say, look, I mean, if a dictatorship pushes you around and there's no consequence, even in the sense of not even any pushback, not even any economic pushback, you just kind of give in. I don't think it's an ideologically motivated conclusion to imagine that they'll come forth and make other demands as they see fit. I mean, does that seem like, I would grant that I also feel this way for ideological reasons, but do you think that's a position that is purely ideological? Don't you think there's some reasonable risk evaluation there to say, look, I mean, if you give up the win, of course.
I guess it need not be purely ideological, but the way that you initially expressed it was suggestive of strong ideological commitments on your part. Now, I guess potentially that could be coupled with a raw cost-benefit analysis, but that the cost-benefit analysis is necessarily speculative. Like, we don't know for sure what would happen if it were the case that the U.S. offered that concession to Russia and just codified their assurance that the NATO open door policy would no longer apply to Ukraine. I mean, I often, when I hear the cost-benefit analysis put that way, saying, look, you believe that Russia would then go further. I don't know whether you mean, invade Moldova or Poland or the Baltics or whatever. But I often, when I hear that, and I was in Poland when the war, shortly after the war broke out, as you may know, so I talked to a lot of Poles who expressed a version of that belief. And, without trying to demean them or talk down to them, because, I didn't grow up experiencing, what life was like in the Warsaw Pact. But I often couldn't help but sort of hear echoes of like a domino theory style interpretation of what Russia was up to, because often their ultimate aims were taken to be also ideological, maybe not strictly Soviet, although you hear people often claim that Russia wants to reconstitute the Soviet empire, or maybe it's sort of like a reactionary
the Russian empire more.
Whatever it is, right? Whatever it is, it's saying, if we allow the domino to fall in Ukraine, then other dominoes will fall as well. And it's just basically a resuscitation of the domino theory, but in this inverted way from Vietnam. And, I think hopefully if we have the same kind of baseline historical understanding, the domino theory did not ultimately hold water, did it?
Well, I don't know.
So I guess I just don't have.
Would it be?
I just don't share. I don't share your surety in formulating a belief about what will happen if a war were averted. That's why I tried to distill it into a very kind of clear and tangible dichotomy. If the war would be averted or not, would you choose X or Y option, right? And you say you wouldn't because you have these beliefs about what would somehow come afterwards. I just don't know that I have an evidentiary basis to be as anywhere near as certain as you are about those.
I think the evidentiary basis is ultimately. I mean, first of all, I think the domino theory question, I don't know that domino theory was exactly disproven. I mean, it is true that after Vietnam, after 20 years of increasingly intense American involvement, communism didn't spread too much farther in Southeast Asia beyond Cambodia and Laos. But I mean, the idea that if the United States had just said in 1955, go ahead, have at it. We don't know. I mean, so if you're going to say you don't know what would happen, that cuts both ways. But beyond that, I do think that Eastern Europe is a little different. Eastern Europe, we do have a pretty long record of Imperial Russian, Soviet Russian, and now Russian Federation expansion into these countries that has progressed. For example, you mentioned Poland, all right? And I can understand why somebody might, without the full historical context, look at, hear somebody in Poland who's worried about war and conclude, well, what are you so worried about? It's obviously not going to happen. They're not going to attack NATO. It's suicidal. Well, I mean, the history of Poland, though, does stretch back quite a ways. And Russia has repeatedly, over the last 400 years, dismembered Poland slice by slice, first through the three partitions of Poland when it worked with Germany to do that, then through the next partition of Poland, where it worked with Germany to dismember Poland, and then through the third partition when it cut a deal with the Western Allies for what the reconstituted and much reduced Polish state would look like. Russia repeatedly pressed similar territorial claims across different regimes. I mean, it's actually kind of wild given how different the Soviet Union was from the Russian Empire that preceded it in terms of ideology, in terms of economic structure, in terms of government, in terms of all of that, how very similar its approach to Polish independence was. In fact, I even just forgot the attempt to conquer Poland right after World War I, when the Red Army attempted to reconquer all of the pieces of the former Russian Empire, and they were turned back by Poland and by the timely assistance of some American fighter pilots, interestingly enough. So history there as well. But in any event, yeah, so this idea that like we can't say that Russia will do this, I mean, look, I think you're kind of battling against reasonable presumption that you can draw from 300 years of Russian colonial expansion, where salami slice by salami slice, they take pieces of Eastern Europe until they ultimately run up against somebody who stops them. There may be reasons why this is the case that are based in geography. Some people say that the Russians continue to expand because their geographical starting point is such that, you know, they have a lot of flat land to defend, and as a result, they have to keep going until they hit a mountain so that they have a more defensible position, you know, or maybe it's because Napoleon invaded and then Hitler invaded, and as a result, it's reasonable, whatever. But I don't think it is. I think it is actually almost, I'd say, a presumption that it's on the part that the person opposing it probably has the obligation to rebut, to say that no, Russia just will go a little bit and then stop forever. Because that is just never been the case. I'm not saying, or at least stop for the foreseeable future. It just is not, you know, in any historical epoch.
I'm not saying
not the way it's worked.
I'm not saying what Russia quote will do.
Well, you're sort
so
of saying
the burden of proof. The burden of proof is not on me, because I'm not asserting that anything in particular will happen. Well, yeah, because it's fundamentally a presumption. I mean, you use that word; it's a presumption.
There's a difference,
so that's it's fundamentally speculative.
Wait, Bastiat, I got to jump in here.
It's fundamentally. I just want to kind of.
But it is. I mean, you're
all right.
Not
to say it's fundamentally speculative.
Are you saying you know with 100% certainty that it would happen?
We don't know with 100% certainty
right. So
what will happen in any situation.
It's definitionally speculation.
But that does not mean that therefore the war is automatically the worst outcome in this situation. Because we do have history we can draw upon. We do have, you know, we can with some reasonable. Accuracy, to your credit, judge how terrible a war might be. We can make assumptions based on reasonable inferences, based on the information that we have, based on history, based on the present, about what will happen next. So we're not just going in the dark here. You know, we're not operating blind here. And I think it is very reasonable. It is not just a 1 or 0 speculative, non-speculative to say we know war will be horrible and we don't know what the alternative will be. Eastern Europeans know what the alternative will be.
All right, I got a button here real quick.
Well, given the extreme...
Hold on one second. I just want to throw in World War II, for example. I know Bastiat was mentioning Poland. Would it not?
By the way, I'm sorry. Could we try to wrap up somewhat soon?
Absolutely, but I just have to say one final thing here. So as far as World War II goes, I know I keep bringing up Adolf Hitler, but if we do take a look at the appeasement that happened there, I don't think it's a matter of saying, well, Russia has some particularly Russian thing about it that makes it go into different countries. What I would say more to, like I was saying in the beginning, why I was comparing Putin to Hitler, was because if you have one leader who is in charge of an entire nation, I don't think that kind of leader would be able to just say stop at any point. I don't think there would be any reason for a dictator to just say, you know, we've reached Ukraine, we're not going to go any further. And that's because there's no accountability there. There's no system in place to make sure that this country of Russia is not going to keep getting more and more and more territory. And that's been my big issue. And I think we can look at World War II and the appeasement that was done, you know, by that piece of paper and say, why is it not the same to say that if similar appeasement is done by the West to Russia, it would not happen? So that's my take. Bastiat, yeah.
There is something kind of interesting, to go to your point, that maybe would also square part of why I feel this way. And maybe why I think it's a little different than the Cold War. And that is kind of interesting that you mentioned that, Lev. That this sort of goes back to the point you mentioned earlier, where Russia today is sort of a personalist kind of dictatorship, as opposed to, you know, the Soviet tyranny, which was a little more institutionalized. You know, there was a party, you know, that could check its individual members, even though the party as a whole oppressed, you know, the Soviet society, you know, or the party elite, at least, because it was a big party. That's sort of, even then, you know, maybe you could come to some kind of terms with an institution in a way that you just couldn't really with a person who has no longer really got any meaningful opposition. He's managed to wipe that out. So I think that's another reason why I would be very skeptical of how how you could really even accede to a demand from someone like that. I mean, like other kind of individual dictators who I think would find success in that. They keep trying that strategy, I think, until it just doesn't work anymore. So I would sort of agree that it's a little different now.
And Michael, any response? I would want to final response from you.
Well, I think your historical soliloquy is well taken, going back, I think, as many as 400 years. But I think we're dealing with the present, and if you at least go off the extreme rhetoric that people use to describe the scale of what they regard to be as the crimes against humanity or even genocide taking place in Ukraine, it seems like the war actually, it was a pretty bad option. I guess you can contend that it would be worse, but we have people saying, this is a genocide. This is just like mass slaughter indiscriminately of civilians and rape and, going after children and all this. So that maybe isn't the style of rhetoric that I would necessarily traffic into to describe how I think the ramifications of the war have transpired. But I do agree that it's a very bad outcome on a number of different levels. And so, that's tangible. That's happening in the present. That's something we can evaluate now in terms of its severity. So for you to kind of hold on to this speculative notion about something potentially happening in the future that would be worse, and that's why averting the war ought to be the number one priority, I can't really identify with that, because, again, it seems like it's premised on a whole host of speculative assumptions that you might say are foreordained given 400 years of Russian history, but however certain you may be about it, it still ultimately is speculative, whereas we don't have to speculate about anything to see what's happening right now in Ukraine and to see that the trajectory policy-wise, at least from the perspective of the U.S. and potentially also Russia, because, I think, in your introductory remarks, you said something interesting. You said that one way that the U.S. has actually de-escalated the war is that it somehow helped Ukraine fend off that initial incursion into Kiev, right? And I think that popular interpretation seems to be sort of folkloric, and that I don't know what the ultimate Russian strategy was. And even if they were genuinely fended off from Kiev, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, said something very interesting this week in Senate testimony, which is now apparently, according to the U.S. intelligence community, they do not believe that the reorientation of Russian forces in the Donbass and in the South actually indicates that the war is going to be contained to those areas. They think it could easily, they seem to believe that it could easily just revert back to a larger scale operation elsewhere in the country. So, that potential success that U.S. weaponry afforded Ukraine in the early weeks of the war probably doesn't necessarily have to have been de-escalatory. It could have potentially been escalatory given the longer term sort of trajectory of the war, right? So anyway, I guess that's probably enough from you. We can leave it there unless there's anything outstanding that I should address.
Just the super chats we have over here. Unless Bastiat, do you have any final question for Michael?
I guess I just I understand your point about we don't know what the future is. It just seems to me to be. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how most people would feel this way. It seems to me like I don't know how you could say, look, we can't make reasonable inferences about the future when we're talking about things like demanding territory. I mean, to say that we should give equal weight to the possibility that, hey, a war won't ensue. With the possibility we should give that equal consideration, equal plausibility, with the view that, look, I mean, if they're mobilizing troops to threaten, or rather marshaling troops to threaten war, maybe they're going to just do it again, a little farther down the line, given that they've got no incentive not to. now that we've kind of given in, I don't think it's reasonable to say that well, we know what's going on in the present, we don't know what might happen in the future, and therefore they're not of equal consideration. I mean, it's we are pattern-seeking animals. That is a very reasonable pattern, I think, to draw based on past events, present incentives, and I think we can say, nevertheless, war is terrible. I certainly agree with that. So that anybody expects things to be so awful in terms of their treatment of civilians in eastern Ukraine, but it is a tragic fact that they have been so awful, and yet I don't think that it for a game well, look, this is basically just, this is the worst of all outcomes. I don't think so. I think the worst of all outcomes is to surrender those folks to Russian rule without even giving them a chance to defend themselves. So.
Well, if we're in a situation that is of such severity in terms of the brinksmanship, whether nuclear or otherwise, then at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, then that alone is a bad enough eventuality that it seems to me reasonable to suggest that everything that could have been done in the power of the U.S. to avert that outcome ought to have been done, and by seemingly your own admission, it wasn't done because the U.S. government or the decision makers share your overriding ideological convictions that led to choose the option that could not have averted the war. Diplomatic kind of focal point around the NATO open door policy. So I think that the U.S. forewent a potential diplomatic avenue to potentially, avert this sort of standoff and this seemingly intractable escalation. Again, we're in a new phase of escalation just this week with the $40 billion that's, on course to be signed into law. And we have the Lend-Lease Act that was just signed by Biden to, restore the World War II era mechanism for just a continuous provision of armaments. I mean, it's just, side note, but it's just amazing to me that there was virtually no debate around that given the potential grave implications. But, I think now, helpfully, it'll be noted in the historical record that even per what you've acknowledged, the U.S. had a potentially viable option that it could have pursued had it wanted to, had it not been sort of so zealously driven by these ideological convictions to avert the war, and it chose not to. I think that's actually something that is quite illuminating and will be reflected back on possibly in years to come.
I hope we at least both agree that the war was ultimately caused by the Russians who invaded Ukraine.
Well,
and to say the way you framed it, that the war, as if Russia is kind of just a natural entity that, look, we could have stopped this natural entity one way or another, like it's some kind of storm, as opposed to an entity with agency that makes decisions on its own. I think that is an important point to remember.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not denying
the United States didn't make this decision because it wanted a war.
Clearly, Putin chose to invade on February 24th, and that started the war. I mean, I don't know how that could be denied. I'm not sure what point is being made in acknowledging that. The point is that indisputable fact.
The United States made a decision not with the point of view of starting a war, and not under the hypothetical that we laid out, where we know it's a 1 or a 0. The United States made a decision to ultimately avoid giving the Russians a win based on violent coercion, and the Russians responded to that, assuming they hadn't already had it planned, which I believe they already did have it planned. They responded to that with war. I think that it is.
And the U.S. also made the decision.
The United States did not cause that.
The U.S. also made the decision to militarize Ukraine, to convert. I know you reject the terminology of an outpost. I mean, maybe that's somewhat pejorative, but to vastly enhance the ability of the U.S. to exert its military influence in Ukraine. That was a decision that was taken by the U.S. on a policy level across multiple administrations in both parties. So that was also another decision that maybe would be worth taking into account. So when you're talking about one decision on that chain on February 24th, when Putin chose to invade, sure, yeah, I mean, that's sort of just a trivial point, really, because of course that's true that he used his agency to take that action. But I think it's also a distortion and a mistake to divorce it from everything that preceded it not to justify the invasion, but to broaden one's understanding, as I've mentioned before, of the conditions which gave rise to the invasion.
Out of curiosity, do you think the chain goes back to include kind of the 400 years of Russian imperial colonial history that I mentioned, or does the chain just begin with, say, 1991? Because I mean, I'll go with you on the chain. I guess ultimately my argument is the chain goes back a lot farther.
I guess the chain that I was thinking of was the one that includes the U.S. as having sort of a determinative policy role in the outcome of events in Ukraine. So there are other chains that one might go down all the way to years ago about Russia's sort of potentially expansionist past. I mean, I'm not actually a history and an expert in whatever Russia was up to in the 1600s or whatever. But the one that I'm talking about, I guess, is a slightly more contemporaneous one. Obviously, a big turning point was 2014 in terms of the U.S. role, that's when it really ramped up the militarization of Ukraine, the acceleration of Ukraine to enter into these different sort of phases of NATO status membership. And so on and so forth. So that's the one that I'm kind of roughly speaking talking about. But I don't deny necessarily that if you want to write a treatise about how this was all foretold by something that Catherine the Great did or whatever, possibly so.
All right, guys, we got to go into the super chats. So let's get into the super chats here. So, and I am going to address a little bit about the thing that happened today, which again I'm sad that things have to work out this way as far as Gio having to leave. I want to make sure that people understand that when we're talking about I don't force Gio to be here, I think there may have been an idea early on, and Gio, let me know if this is not the case, that some people may have had the idea that I'm kind of forcing you to be on this stream, I'm not letting you do anything else. I want to make it clear that I don't force you to be on the stream, that you come on the stream because you enjoy coming on here. And since you also mentioned the payment factor, as much as I was able to pay. But again, this is like contract stuff. I don't want to get into that stuff right now here publicly. But the point is that I always welcome you on the stream. I respect the fact that you have alternate views to more mainstream people, and I think that a lot of the concerns that you bring up are concerns that should be addressed. In today's stream, it was more of a matter of if we're talking about a specific kind of conversation and then you talk about something very, very different, especially when we have three people talking at once, there has to be some kind of a lessening of that, just to make sure that people are able to hear what everybody else is saying. Now, later on, though, I did want it to be the case that I would ask Michael a question, Bastiat, and then bring it to you, and you would be able to talk about the question in relation to what was talked about. I see no problem doing that. And again, you're always welcome on BTR, and I can get into a little bit more in detail later on. I don't want to waste Bastiat and Michael's time with this, but suffice to say that I do enjoy a lot of the things that you talk about, not the political things, but the philosophical and artistic things, and I really value that. But anyway, let's get to the super chats here. So, Dunkachino, $1.99. For Michael Tracey, when do you go back to OnRob? Michael Tracey left just as I was asking him the question. So next super chat over here. Zach, was that a reference to something? I don't know. On Rob. Any idea, Bastiat? No?
I'm not sure. Maybe that was I know there were people in chat saying, Bastiat, do you have ligma? And then you follow up and say ligma balls. So maybe there was something like that.
Maybe. All right.
I'm not sure what he's mentioning.
All right. Next over here, Zach, £5. In 2011, Biden spoke publicly to students in Russia that Putin shouldn't run for the presidency. Talk about meddling in another country. Interesting. Sure. And next one, yeah.
For what it's worth, I want to say, Gio, if you're listening, I'm happy to talk with you at length. Now, it just is super, it's super hard to go back and forth. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Gio, if you want,
I really wanted to.
Gio, if you want to come,
I'll be happy to talk at length.
Yeah, if you want to come back, maybe for another stream. I mean, I know that you guys have contentions. I know, Bastiat, you tell me if I'm mistaken here, but even though I am very biased towards Ukraine, I allowed, Michael to speak about anything that he wanted to fully. I didn't interrupt Michael, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, my only kind of frustration was that I, was trying to kind of go back and forth, and occasionally something else would come up, and I kind of lose the whole kind of
Yeah, I mean
train of thought here.
that's the nature of the beast. I mean, on BTR, obviously, when we have more kitchens in the chef, more cooks in the kitchen, it gets a lot harder to do that. But at the same time, I think having like 4 people on, it really isn't the worst, and I think there are ways of balancing that out without getting distracted. Anyway, on to the other super chat over here. Let's see here. Massive McGee, £2. Can we calm down and talk about the orangutan flanges? So this was back from a BTR stream where we had this guy named Sunny on who was talking about how in the jungle, the orangutan flanges, they grow, they get to be really big and puffy, while in the zoo, the male orangutans, who are not the alpha, they don't have the flanges, and they end up jerking it to whatever the alpha is doing with the female. And that was kind of his analogy to pornography today, that we're all kind of like these. And that's the other thing, by the way, like if I were to pick one criticism with more of like the neoliberal people, it would be that, if I were to be advocating for more of a reactionary thought here, it would be that I don't think this is your opinion, this is more of like the caricature that people make, is that people don't want life to just be about GDP growth, to just be about that. I'm not saying that you're about that.
I get you. Look, what is GDP growth, right? What is that? Is that just a number? It's not just a number, right? That's your wages. That's the productivity of the country, the ability to buy goods and services of all kinds of different types, a heightened standard of living, so that you can do what? So that you can live your life in the way you best see fit. It's not just about raising numbers or graphs or anything. It's about creating the kind of society where people have the ability to live their lives to the fullest. And that's really what it's about. So to say, well, life is about more than money, it's about, I agree, but money is an end toward that. The reason we want a richer society is so that people can have more freedom to do things they want to do.
And I'm not opposed to the richer society part. What I am opposed to, though, is just the, they have that cliche on the internet, why don't you just let people enjoy things? The reason why I'm not that big of a fan of it is I do believe in hierarchy. I do believe there are people who set good standards for other people to follow, because I think most people do benefit from having some model to reach out to and say, like, hey, I want to be like this person. I want to achieve all these great things that this person has achieved. And just the idea that's coming from more of the reactionary angle, I think, is there's too many people today that aren't really looking up to anybody other than their own hedonistic urges. And again, I don't think that's fully correct. I mean, it's a very broad statement. But at the same time, I think things like that do have to be watched out for. And it's not something that people should just dismiss and say, like, oh, there's nothing to work on in the culture. Everything is fine.
Yeah. And I was just messaging Michael. I think his feed cut out, so he might be gone. But it sounds like his feed just kind of cut out.
Oh, so, yeah. So it had nothing to do with the super chat.
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to let you know that it sounded like it.
All right. Oh, and by the way, this comment, Lev thinks I'm a monster. He calls me a fascist. Use my real name and face, knows what that means. I can't. Okay, first of all, Gio, you do have views that are very reactionary, while at the same time, I do not think you're a monster at all. I think that you are misguided in some of the solutions you see to the problems that I share with you. As far as I share with you the problems of people, not having something, like a higher goal to live for. And I think we both want, I think all three of us, honestly, Bastiat, I would include you here as well, want people to live for higher goals, for it to just be more than just, partying at the club or texting on Zoom or, God forbid, making politics, the be-all, end-all of everything. So there has to be more for people to live for. And what I appreciate about you, Gio, is that you are able to raise these questions up. The only problem, and I've never been shy about talking about this with you, the only problem is that when you actually talk about the solutions to these problems, and you've admitted yourself on the stream with counterpoints that the solution hasn't been fully formed, but you don't shy away from solutions that are much more fascistic minded, are much more authoritarian or even totalitarian minded. And that is the part about your sensibilities that I'm not a big fan of, but I never shy away from saying that. Because I want to eventually see, maybe you can see things in a different way about that. I think you can, because I think that deep inside, you have a good heart, and I don't know. And again, like I said before, the whole thing that I was talking about with you, not having to come on if you don't want to, was because I don't want to force you to come on BTR if you don't like the way that BTR is run. And as I said from the beginning, I do run BTR, and as far as all the things that we talked about in private, those are things that we talked about in private. And again, I would respect those things, not, again, what the deal there is, and again, I always appreciate the good takes that you have, and that's all I got to say there.
Right on.
All right. Well,
and again,
yes.
I think it'd be fun to talk with Gio sometime. Also, I saw people keep saying in the chat, you said you don't even know who he is. I said that because I didn't know who he is, not because I'm trying to wave around my status like I'm somebody special. I just think I don't know. Well, I don't know.
No, but that's
I prepared for a discussion with Michael Tracey. That's what I thought I was coming into.
That's
so I was not really,
that's the big thing that I think BTR is doing. And again, if Gio wants to come back, I would love for Gio to come back.
I'll stick around as long as anybody would like.
Yeah, but the thing about BTR is the very fact that you, Bastiat, did not know who Gio is, and you don't know who Zero HP Lovecraft is, right?
Who's HP Lovecraft?
Zero HP Lovecraft.
Oh, no, I don't know who that is.
Okay, what about Bronze Age Pervert?
I'm familiar with that name. Is that one of those 2016 type, red pill original type people?
Kind of around there. No, but the idea that I'm getting to is, I think that you do have important things to share with people who otherwise don't listen to you, and vice versa. I think there's a lot of things from Gio's side that a lot of the people in your community may benefit from listening to. And
the rhetoric just accused him of wrongthink. I don't know what wrongthink is exactly. Obviously, I think I have clear disagreements with Gio. I'm not trying to belabor the point here, but since the chat is kind of going on about this, I think I have clear disagreements, but I don't know that I've accused him of wrongthink. It's just it's a totally different approach to this issue than either Michael or I were describing, and it's it's just a whole different thing. It's not even it's just a whole different thing. I wasn't expecting it, and so I was trying to kind of keep back and forth, like when Michael and I were going back and forth about Reagan said this, but Biden said this. I'm trying to go back and forth kind of on the subject. That's all.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Let's see what the future